Chris O'Connor here. Join our fabulous curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist dedicated to this episode. Now, let's get started.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. As we continue our second Golden Age of Rock series, we now step into the 1970s, a decade that took the innovations of the 1960s and expanded upon them, the sonic landscape being shaped for the next generation. In fact, expansion is the overall theme of this episode. Rock and R&B/soul got more eclectic and widespread than it ever had been, setting the stage for the wide variety of music in the years to come, and the year 1970 truly was the ground zero moment for that. As the turbulent 1960s ended, a new brand of cool, laid-back, mellowed-out soft rock emerged from LA's Topanga Canyon, Laurel Canyon, and beyond, and defined a generation. James Taylor's Sweet Baby James, Joni Mitchell's Ladies of the Canyon, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young's Deja Vu, Cat Stevens' Tea for the Tillerman, all of them. Yet, does Neil Young's classic After the Gold Rush album single-handedly blow all these records away? The Beatles officially broke up, and John, Paul, and George wasted no time releasing solo albums that, while redefining themselves as artists, both delighted and confounded both fans and critics. In the world of R&B and soul, James Brown changed the game again with a leaner, meaner, grittier, even more stripped-down version of the funk he invented with the song Sex Machine. The live album of the same name released this year is also one of the best live albums of all time. Black Sabbath emerged as rock's first true bona fide heavy metal band and unleashed their mind-blowingly influential first two albums. Iggy Pop and The Stooges released an album that, while not being a commercial success at all, would in short time go on to be a monumental touchstone and quintessential, indispensable record in the rapidly developing firestorm soon to be known as punk rock. And of course, there was a plethora of era-defining and equally influential albums by the likes of Simon and Garfunkel, Creedence Clearwater Revival, The Grateful Dead, Santana, Curtis Mayfield, Funkadelic, and several others. Yes, 1970 was indeed a very, very stacked year. So, kick back, roll up that doobie, and let's reminisce on a time when the baby boomer generation wasn't an embarrassment to make snarky social media memes out of. Welcome to the Curmudgeon Rock Report. All right, folks, usually this is the point in the podcast where Chris would introduce our parallel universe recommendations, our segment where if rock music were still a part of the pop cultural zeitgeist, these albums and these artists would be huge stars and big name things. Well, we're not doing that this episode. This episode, we are going to stay in our current universe. You can tell because you don't hear the sound effects that you normally hear.
What? No music. Oh, gosh.
When we travel to our parallel universe. No, we're staying right here for two reasons. Number one, I really want to talk about the new St. Vincent record. St. Vincent is kind of a big star. She's not really a parallel universe candidate. And Chris wants to talk about the latest big name, big time feud in hip hop happening between Kendrick Lamar and Drake. And only Chris can really bring the hip hop perspective and the hip hop scholar that he is and bring that perspective into it. But first, let's start with St. Vincent in our current universe where she is a star. and her brand new album, All Born Screaming, which came out actually last month. Now, the last we heard from St. Vincent was 2021 when she released her excellent album, Daddy's Gone, her ode to 1970s pop, rock, and soul, but all refashioned in her own distinct, unique style. Her new album, All Born Screaming, is another radical departure in how dazzlingly eclectic and versatile it is. Musically, it's her strongest and most diverse set of songs since her self-titled album from 10 years ago, which to this day is still probably her greatest album. The specter of 1990s alternative and industrial rock looms large over this album as intense tracks like Broken Man and Big Time Nothing owe a debt to Nine Inch Nails and Depeche Mode, while Hell Is Near finds St. Vincent doing her best Tori Amos impression. The drama of Portishead style trip hop is touched upon with violent times, while Sweetest Fruit harkens back to the electro funk of St. Vincent's own Mass Seduction album from 2017. The shifting time signatures and multi-section song structures of progressive rock rear their head with Flea. The album's last two tracks are probably St. Vincent's most impressive stylistic forays, as So Many Planets dives deep into dub reggae, and the album's title track swoons in the traditional Soweto music sound of South Africa. Lyrically, the album's overall theme is death and mortality, as almost every single song mentions it in some shape or form. She must have had a death to someone close to her because it's pretty striking how prevalent the theme is. Frankly, it's a little too overbearing, and she's written better lyrics on her previous albums. But musically, St. Vincent has never been stronger, especially how all these disparate styles are tied together by her wonderfully textured guitar playing, always one of her most underrated strong suits. It's an easy 4 out of 5 stars, and it's easily going to be one of my top 10 albums of this year. Chris?
Yeah, this album makes me I leave this album wanting more of the industrial rock or more of the industrial songs like and she released all three of them as singles prior to the release of the record last month. Broken Man, Flea, and Big Time Nothing. All of those in a row, they have that industrial tinge to them. I mean, Broken Man to me is basically a Polly Jean Harvey song as rendered by Trent Reznor.
Yeah, it really is.
It has that kind of spookiness and icy industrial noise going on both at the same time, and it's a pretty impressive hybrid accomplishment. But the thing is I see some inconsistency in there, and again, I've only heard the album a couple of times, and so I need to spend some more time with it, as is usually the case with your albums that you recommend. It's just, to me, Hell Is Near and the title track are a little bit, I don't know. They're a little bit kind of drawn out a little bit. Tori Amos, I think, is a good call. Kate Bush, unfortunately, is another, another evocation, to me, on those songs. And so I think that, just musically, yes. Is it diverse? Yes. Is it her most diverse record? Most definitely. I don't think the guitar is quite as strong as it was on Daddy's Home. Altogether, I think that was a very good. That album was very strong on the guitars. This one, not quite there. But again, I want to hear more industrial noise from Annie Clark. I think that that's her most engaging stuff, maybe ever, to be honest with you. I think it fits her. It fits her to a T. It fits her like a glove. And more of that, please, is all I can say.
I'm okay with that too, but I like the record as is. I like how concise it is. It's really, it's really kind of like it's focused. It's really, really focused, and that's what I like about it. You don't get any instrumental segues. You don't get any like less under 1 minute noise parts that introduce one song to the other. I kind of like that aspect of the record.
Yeah,
but I do admit an all industrial rock album by St. Vincent would definitely be welcome as well.
Yeah, and that's what I come away with wanting. I mean, I definitely want, and I listen to those songs on repeat several times in preparing for this episode. So Yes, more of that.
She produced this record herself.
Yes,
The
she
first
did.
album that she actually did. Maybe we can get her together with Trent Reznor for the next one.
Yeah, although she worked with Kate LeBon on All Born
Mm,
Screaming.
mm,
I don't think that LeBon produced it, but I think that she guests on it.
right.
So it's the
Mm,
closest she comes to having a collaborator.
right.
But I think that fits her too, and that surprised me when I read that she had self-produced it. Like I knew she had the musical chops, but who knew that she could engineer like
Yeah.
that? Hey, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. Speaking
Right.
speaking of engineering, let's now go into one of the most engineered spectacles of this entire decade of the 2020s, and talking about this burgeoning or this amazingly deep and prolific feud between two of the best or two of the most well-known rappers on the planet, Kendrick Lamar and Drake. Kendrick Lamar being one of the best, Drake certainly being one of the most high profile. Uh,
That's putting it nicely.
yeah,
In
yeah.
other words, he's probably the worst, most overrated superstar hip hop has ever produced.
Yeah, he's certainly one of them, and he's like his style is one of the ones responsible for the kind of the overwrought maudlin sentimentality that you get in this sort of the hey, we think we can sing
Moody,
style.
mellow, ethereal, synthesizer driven, sad sack hip hop.
Yeah, that's pretty much what it is. Although I will say this, Drake, when he wants to, can can really get into his bag of tricks and actually can rap. And he can rap pretty well when he decides to go hard. He's at his best, and I think that that's true of this feud with Lamar. Now, this all goes back like a little more than a decade. That these two have harbored some resentment towards each other as they both back 2012 2013 as they were both getting big and breaking out into the mainstream. They had these sort of lingering resentments, and there were always speculations that there might be little disses that there maybe was a diss somewhere on To Pimp a Butterfly of Drake, or that Drake had some hidden disses of Kendrick, and so that had always been speculated. But then what happens is early this year, in March, there's a single released called "Like That" by Future, Metro Boomin, and Kendrick Lamar. And in his verse, and this actually stems from an earlier track in which J. Cole and Drake appear, where Drake basically there's a reference to those three as being kind of the title holders of kind of the king of modern hip hop, but Drake is kind of like, well, but Kendrick's in a distant third. And so this starts in earnest, and that single came out on March 22nd of this year, like that. And Kendrick in his lyric disses the hell out of Drake, and basically says that he's not that great, and just sort of basically is a put down of basically putting Lamar over as much better, and putting Drake down as a phony. Well, Drake responded to that within 2 weeks, and within like the first like the second week of April. And that's what's unusual, that obviously there's a long history of beefs in hip hop. And
Yeah.
we on our last episode we covered one of those, or a couple of those. We had the Boogie Down Productions crew in the Bronx, and the Juice crew in Queens that had beef, and that were battle rapping at that point, back in 1987. And then you had Kool Moe Dee and LL in 89, 90, 91 through there, which LL won definitively with Mama Said Knock You Out. And
Yeah.
then, you keep going from there. Jay-Z and Nas got into it in 2001 with a couple of brilliant songs. There was Jay-Z's the Takeover, and then Nas's response, Ether, which was just killer. I mean, basically, he won that feud hands down. So there's this history. But this one is unique because of the speed of it. Each guy has released at least 4 songs. since the beginning of April. We're recording this on May 17th. Since the beginning of April, each has released and sort of instantly, and they released them. One of them was released through Instagram, another was released through a podcast, and they've basically taken social. If there was any doubt that social media is now one of the foremost distribution vehicles for modern music, I mean, this is proving it, because the speed, and these songs take off like wildfire. One of them, which is a song that Kendrick released called "Not Like Us," actually reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. And so, and ostensibly because of the demand for the feud,
Right.
not because of any kind of musical quality. Like literally here today, gone tomorrow. But anyway, so Drake first responds with "Push-Ups," which, and none of these songs. The funny thing about it is these songs, the raps are brutal, and they're about the most personal I've ever heard a hip hop feud get. But the music all sucks except for one song, which we'll get to. But "Push-Ups" is this really kind of corny, cheap beat kind of sounding thing where basically Drake makes a bunch of short jokes at Kendrick's expense. And he also is basically accusing him of being a pop sellout. One lyric in there, he says, "Maroon 5 need a verse, you better make it witty."
Drake is accusing Kendrick Lamar of being a pop sellout.
Yeah.
Drake.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Drake is accusing Kendrick Lamar of that.
Of being a pop sellout. Yeah, absolutely. And of saddling up to Taylor Swift.
Talk about a complete, utter lack of self-awareness.
Yeah, exactly. And then, also accusing Kendrick of conspiring with Taylor Swift to basically to kind of prop up Taylor's sales and, avoid whatever.
I don't think Taylor Swift needs Kendrick Lamar's help in propping up her sales.
Yeah, exactly. And so basically he does push-ups. A couple of days later in April, he released a song called "Tailor Made Freestyle." Get it? Tailor-made freestyle. And dissing Lamar, tying him to Taylor Swift, making him out to be a true sellout. And he actually, there's a line on one of those songs called Heart.
That's like MC Hammer calling Chuck D a sellout.
Yeah, pretty much. There's a line, I believe it's on Push-Ups. It's either on Push-Ups or "Tailor-Made Freestyle." It says, "Heartbroke Twitter shit is for bitches." And so basically kind of getting there and starting to make it personal.
Why doesn't Taylor Swift make her own diss track?
Yeah, well, that'd be wonderful. I would love it. Well, dude, half her songs are diss tracks
about her ex-boyfriends.
About her ex-boyfriends, yeah. So yeah, she's like the queen of diss songs, of diss pop songs. So there you go. But anyway, so Push-Ups comes out, and then Tailor Made Freestyle comes out. Now Drake actually got himself in trouble for Tailor Made Freestyle because the original version had an AI altered rendition, a vocal rendition that made it seem like Tupac and Snoop were rapping the chorus. Yeah. And Tupac's estate got pissed. And so so he had to take that version off of social media. Now, a version of it without the Tupac and Snoop silliness is available on the streaming sites. So not under Drake's name, though. I think it's some riff on his label name, OVO. It's like DVO or something that he's got it out there available. So he does that. Well, Kendrick is now kind of pissed, and it's like, oh, okay, you're going to come at me like that. And then he comes out with this astonishing, and this is only like 3 weeks ago. I mean, it was really just kind of recent. This astonishing 6.5-minute long diss track called Euphoria. And Euphoria, you can't really call it a song because it's got like 4 different beats that go on in it over the course of 6.5 minutes. And he just absolutely goes off on Drake, calling him a master manipulator. There's a line, you're not a rap artist, you a scam artist. And at one point, it was a great line. He says, "Don't tell lies about me, and I won't tell truths about you." And he also basically he gets on Drake for plastic surgery, And most effectively and most kind of stunningly on this song, he gets on Drake for his biracialness.
Mm.
Aubrey Graham is in fact half white, and basically he says I don't like it. I don't like it when you use the N word, or he actually ends the song singing, "We don't want to hear you say no and no more."
Yeah.
And just basically saying it's like he basically tells him that he's not allowed to say the N word.
Mm.
And he also accuses him of having surgically enhanced his abs. Uh, and it just
It won't
really,
surprise me if that's true, though.
yeah, just really strange shit. And so a couple days after that, uh, Kendrick, much like Drake, comes out with a second straight volley. And this is called 616 in LA, which was released as part of an Instagram story. And basically, again, accuses Drake of lying about Kendrick and about Kendrick's history. And a really kind of clever Al Green sample. It's a "Let's Stay Together" sample.
Mm.
But basically, the most inventive thing that he does here, well, one, he accuses him of playing dirty with propaganda and saying basically stop lying. But he also accuses a bunch of Drake's entourage of being against Drake. He says you have 100 N words on your payroll and 20 want to kill you.
Mm.
That basically says, all these you got, and like one of your main guys is like hates your guts and all of that, and just basically calling him a phony and all this other stuff. And so it's just so there you go. And so now it's starting to get brutal. And then now Drake takes that and he's like, "Oh, you're calling me a liar, and you're calling me a manipulator. You're calling me a fake." Oh yeah. Well, Drake comes out with "Family Matters." No, not it's not set to the tune of the old sitcom uh, song, but it's called "Family Matters." And here he starts accusing Kendrick Lamar of domestic abuse, and and not only that, but also accuses and basically makes the insinuation that one of his kids is not his.
Mm.
That
Wow.
like some other guy named Dave Free is actually the
Uh-huh.
father, and
Uh-huh.
and apparently at some point in one of the earlier songs, Kendrick had hit Drake with a cease and desist
Mm.
letter, and so Drake comes back and says a cease and desist is for hoes, and then he accuses him of putting his hands on his girl. When you put your hand on your girl, is it self-defense because she's bigger than you? Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's that. And so it's starting to get like ugly at this point. So now it's Kendrick's turn. And the next song in this suite of diss tracks is called Meet the Grams, which on its own, it's the only one of these songs that stands really as an actual song, and two is actually musically good. And it's actually kind of a stunning uh, because one, because it gets really nasty. That it's called Meet the Grams, and it's basically in the first verse, Kendrick addresses uh, uh, Drake's son Adonis and says, "I'm sorry that man is your father." And at one point, I look at him and wish your grandpa had worn a condom. Yeah. And the second verse addresses Drake's mom, and he says, "You gave birth to a master manipulator. You raised a horrible fucking person." And then the last verse on it addresses Drake himself and says that, he's got gambling problems and woman problems and all that. He refers to him as a body shamer because he hides all of his secret baby mamas. He says, you lied about your son, you lied about your daughter. And this is where he kind of insinuates, and it's in the next song that he really goes there. It basically accuses Drake of having an illegitimate 11-year-old daughter.
Uh-huh.
Uh, and then at the end, has a line, "Fuck a rap battle. This is a lifelong battle with yourself."
Mm.
Yeah. So now it's getting personal. And then comes "Not Like Us," which we said was a number one song, and it's got this West Coast trap beat, and I think he was probably going for something a little bit more commercial.
Yeah.
The idea is if we're going to be releasing all this music, at least let's try to chart while we're doing
Yeah.
it. and yeah, it's kind of a corny ass minimalist beat. It sounds, cheap drums. I mean, it's almost like something Too Short would have produced back in the day. But but basically, it's astonishing because it basically accuses Drake and everybody in his entourage of having sex with minors, and basically says all of them are sex offenders and pedophiles.
Mm.
And he also at the end he gets personal, says that basically Drake in the last few years, he's done a lot of collaborations with guys like Future and 21 Savage and Metro Boomin, and basically he says that Drake is running to Atlanta when you need a few dollars, and he calls Drake he calls him a colonizer, saying that he's trying to take over Atlanta. And then, of
Mm.
course, he goofs on OVO and calls him an OV ho, which is corny as hell,
Yes.
but there you go. And then Drake finally, then this is the last, and this was released on May 6th. This is the last volley to date in this. It's called Heart Part 6. And that kind of, the title is a goof on a series of tracks that Kendrick put out called Heart Part 1, Heart Part 2,
Yeah.
and so on.
Yeah.
But this is Heart Part 6. And this is where Drake, in it, and it's kind of amazing. He says that, well, you fell for my entourage planting the thing about the 11-year-old daughter.
Mm.
He says you have to learn how to fact check things. And then he basically says, oh, and by the way, everybody should know you haven't seen your kids in the last 6 months. And then he says he wants to slit Kendrick's throat with a razor and all this other shit. And and so now you've got one guy calling the other a woman beater, and the other calling the other a sex offender and a father of illegitimate children. And so this is some personal shit. But I will say this, that overall, I would say the winner right now is Kendrick Lamar.
Mm.
That is, at least with Meet the Grams, Drake has managed to bring the best out in Kendrick, which, as everybody knows, is pretty damn good. And Meet the Grams it's as good as anything on Damn, or on what was the name of the last record, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers.
Which I love that record. That's a great record.
Yeah, that's a pretty good record, but it's as strong as anything on those records. And Drake, to his credit, he's stepped up too. That he's Heart Part 6 and Family Matters are actually pretty good. And Drake he's motivated and he's nasty. I mean, Family Matters especially is just brutal, like absolutely fucking brutal. So anyway, that's kind of my run through of these songs. Kendrick so far, I'd say, is the winner, but not by much. And I think this is going to go down as uh, the it'll go down as the most memorable and the least memorable feud of all time in hip hop. The most
Yeah.
memorable because of the content, the least memorable because of the music.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's exactly.
Let's just put it this way. There is no BDP South Bronx. There is no
Right.
LL Cool J's Mama Said Knock You Out. There is no
Right.
Nas's Ether. Uh,
Right.
with the exception of Meet the Grams, this is a bunch of crap
Yeah, it really is. Yeah. I
musically.
mean, the media attention that this feud has gotten is more impressive than any of the songs that have been released. I mean, yes, of course, the Drake songs suck. But then again, saying Drake music sucks is like saying the sky is blue. You just take it as a given.
Yeah.
Everything he does is crap. I'm a big Kendrick Lamar fan, and I'm disappointed by how half-assed his songs are here. Even though lyrically it's not half-assed, because lyrically he's really digging after Drake. But musically, yeah, like you said, it's just not very memorable. The beats are kind of whack.
Yeah,
And it's just
well,
yeah,
and they're low rent district too,
and they're not developed. They're underdeveloped.
and they're
They're
not real
underdeveloped.
beats. I mean, Euphoria is like literally like four ideas and concepts
Yeah,
that are just kind of stitched together, and it kind of
right.
and the only thing that makes it consistent is the fact that Kendrick makes it so engaging in his flow, and he's tearing Drake a new asshole. He's catching a body on
Yeah,
Euphoria.
right.
I think in terms of if you're going to score a feud in terms of effectiveness of the body blows,
Yeah.
That song is the highest ranking one of the entire
Right.
sequence, followed probably by Family Matters by Drake as far as body blows landed,
Mm,
you know.
yeah.
So
Yeah, but yeah, like I said, this feud is like you said. I think you got it right. It's the content of what they're saying to each other more than the actual songs.
yeah, and on content, I can't think of another feud that has gotten this nasty,
Yeah.
or has gotten to this level. Well, with the exception, okay, fine, you've got Tupac's "Hit 'Em Up" on Biggie, and
And
both.
Tupac and Biggie ended in both of them getting killed. I don't think that's going to happen here.
Yeah, somehow I don't think these guys are putting hits out on each other. I think that they're going to be professionals and move on.
Yeah.
Those guys got each other killed,
Yeah.
you know. So I think that's the last word. Nobody's dying in the great Drake Kendrick Lamar battle of 2024. People. Chris here again. Arturo and I have differing feelings about the subscription streaming service Spotify. While he likes to rail against the algorithmic component, I like the ability to find and then manage a personal catalog of music. The program is especially great for assembling playlists. Well, guess what? We've assembled a playlist to accompany this episode. The playlist features a healthy mix of all the music we describe and analyze during the episode. Think of it as a soundtrack to your curmudgeonly life. Find the link in this episode's description. And also become a member of our curmudgeonly community on Facebook if you haven't done so already. Let's now return to our regularly scheduled programming.
So 1970, like I mentioned in our parameter setter, the overall theme, okay, is basically the expansiveness of rock, how eclectic and widespread it had gotten. But one section of the story of 1970 that really is what 1970 kind of is all about is the whole the way the whole introspective confessional singer-songwriter stuff, mostly from the West Coast of the US, blew up big. James Taylor with Sweet Baby James, Joni Mitchell with Before Blue, Ladies of the Canyon, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young's Deja Vu, Cat Stevens from over in the UK, but he might as well have sounded like a California guy with T for the
Yeah.
Tillerman. And of course, Neil Young's brilliant solo record of that year after the Gold Rush. So yeah, the mellow sounds of soft rock is really like the first main story of 1970. And whether we like some of these albums or not, we got to talk about them. And
Yes.
Chris, let's start.
Yeah, I think there was a prevalence, and you're right. Soft rock and softer rock and folky rock was really kind of the theme of this year. This is
Yeah.
a year in which the Beatles officially broke up. More on that later. This was also following some pretty dark and depressing stuff that happened at the end of
Right.
1969 and the first few months of
Mhm.
1970. It was a really heavy time for the country. So let's get into this, and we'll start by talking and focusing on the soft rock dynamic. We'll kind of make James Taylor the initial focus.
Yeah.
So by the fall of 1970, James Taylor was the right guy with the right sound at the right time.
And the right heroin addiction.
Well, that too. Few artists have taken advantage of the convergence of mood and place quite like Taylor, who entered 1970 as a barely on the radar gentle acoustic balladeer and one-time signee of the Beatles' Apple Records, and left it as a pop superstar and quietly smoldering and charismatic sex symbol. What the hell happened? Uh,
Yeah.
a lot did actually. A lot was actually already happening as the 1960s ended and the 1970s began. Flower power and wide-eyed innocence had been pushed aside by the increasing horrors of the Vietnam War and disturbing events like the Tate LoBianco murders carried out by the followers of cult leader Charles Manson in August of 1969, and the murder of a young black man named Meredith Hunter at the front of the stage by members of the Hells Angels biker gang as the Rolling Stones played near the end of the Ultimate Speedway Free Festival out there in California in December of 1969. There also was the burgeoning, menacing, and mean-spirited presidency of Richard Milhous Nixon that led to tumult on college campuses. the shooting death of 4 protesting students by National Guardsmen at Kent State University in Ohio occurred in May of 1970. There was real pain and real exhaustion, and there was a longing for something simpler and nicer. This coincided with the maturation of the rock and roll generation, basically the boomers. During 1970, the happening party slowly, gently wound down. By that October, James Taylor had become the face of what was dubbed as soft rock. Whoa. What everyone, especially rock fans verging on age 30, wanted was quiet, and pop was there to serve, writes author David Brown in his engaging book, Fire and Rain, The Beatles, Simon and Garfunkel, James Taylor, CSNY, and The Lost Story of 1970. Long title. Quoting from the book again, Dylan turning to country music was one thing. The rise of this new genre, with the seemingly contradictory name soft rock, was a telling sign of the times. Some of the musicians, like Cat Stevens and Neil Diamond, were once teen market scrub pop stars who'd given themselves Shaggy Dog makeovers. Some, like Gordon Lightfoot, had been making folk records for years, but had grown out their hair and now looked like members of the Back to the Land movement. Quote, in this context, Fire and Rain found a home. Fire and Rain, as I'm sure many of you listening to this here podcast likely know, was a massive hit for James Taylor, springing from his excellent second record, Sweet Baby James. For as charming and as sweetly disarming as Taylor could be, he was also a pretty tortured guy. He was the product of a well-to-do family from North Carolina that summered in Martha's Vineyard, and he was a sensitive, shy guy who found himself gravitating towards drugs and alcohol and other self-destructive behavior in general. He also spent time in Massachusetts-based mental institutions on 2 different occasions, including one of those times was right before the release of his debut self-titled album. By the middle of 1970, he had rediscovered an old friend as well, an old friend named heroin. Fire and Rain, then, is a chronicle of Taylor's troubled life and times. It starts with the death by accidental overdose of an old girlfriend and then somehow grows darker from there. But boy is the song, which like others on Sweet Baby James features Carole King on piano, sure is pretty and hummable. And to the chagrin of music executives at Warner Brothers Records, a chart winner. Fire and Rain reached number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 singles chart in the fall of 1970 and catapulted Taylor from college campuses into the arena set. The rest of Sweet Baby James is just as winning. There's the laid-back yet anthemic Country Road. There's the soft, sweet, hopelessly earnest acoustic strummer Lo and Behold. There's the rousing tongue-in-cheek Steamroller Blues, a goof on guys like him that less ironically whiten the blues. And there's an adorable cover of the 19th century American standard Oh Susanna. You know, that's the one about the guy going to Alabama with a banjo on his knee. Sweet Baby James was the sound of a soft rocking guy who lived hard and felt even harder. The album set the tone for AM radio loveliness and, let's face it, a bunch of fluff that followed in its wake. David Brown writes, possibly because the times demand it, Taylor has been hailed as a bridge over troubled waters, wrote a Billboard critic. He's in a place where people can go and be soothed, clarified, and cradled. I'll stop here for a second. Art, give me some thoughts on James Taylor and soft rock.
Sweet Baby James is one fucking continuous shower of shit. What a load of lightweight, middle-of-the-road, conservative, bland, safe, puff, woofy, soft, wuss, folky shit rock. My God. Talk about a guy who's like made a career off one really great song, Fire and Rain, and has made nothing but cheesy white boy blues and just the softest of soft folk music afterward. God, it's softer than toilet paper.
Oh,
My
stop.
God, it's horrible. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I understand why they're
Granted, everything that came after Sweet Baby James probably is a fit descriptor of everything you just said. But Sweet Baby James itself has got its merits, man. That's for what it is. It's a good soft folk rock type of
The
record.
dude for 50 plus years has gotten all that mileage from one great song and his wussy pussy image. Basically, that's the story of James Taylor's career.
I don't know. His image wasn't wussy pussy back then. He was a bona fide sex symbol. Remember, he was also in the movie Two Lane Blacktop that year.
Pretty good
You know,
movie, actually.
yeah, with
And his
him
acting
and
wasn't
Dennis
very good.
Wilson.
His
Yeah,
acting wasn't very good either.
yeah. Neither was Dennis Wilson's. I said it's a wonderfully cheesy ass movie. But he had chops. Like I said, he was a compelling character, and then of course he got sober and bald, and that was that. Once he got sober and bald, that was the beginning of the end, and he spent the last 40 years being a cornball. So there you go. He lives up in the Berkshires in Massachusetts, so up there with Arlo Guthrie. Ick, you know. So anyway, let us now continue with our discussion of not just Taylor but soft rock from here. Now, James Taylor recorded "Sweet Baby James" soon after he moved to Los Angeles in 1969. There, he found himself among an equally ambitious and rambunctious set of musicians whose musical sensibilities and landing point on the development curve were about the same. He was surrounded by a bunch of people who were not yet quite stars. Quote, and this is a quote from Taylor, and I'm lifting this from Fire and Rain, the book. Quote, it was from a time when nothing much was expected of me, so I didn't have the burden of expectations of coming up with something that was going to be commercially successful. It was a relatively free and easy time. I had a sort of group, a family in Los Angeles that I was managed by, living with, loving with, and making music with. And that was a nice thing, end quote. Turns out one of those fellow Los Angeles-based soon-to-be stars was a woman named Joni Mitchell, who Taylor began dating during the latter half of 1970. Mitchell, too, enjoyed her big break in 1970 after beginning her career in relative obscurity, though also dating David Crosby for a time in the late 1960s.
And Graham Nash.
Yeah, well, at the beginning of 1970, she was dating Graham Nash. I was going to actually mention that.
Yeah.
She started the year with Graham Nash, ended the year with James Taylor. But anyway, her album from 1970, Ladies of the Canyon, is not as celebrated as her later 1970s efforts, including Blue and Hejira, but it arguably should be. The album in many ways counts as minimalist free jazz, mostly featuring Mitchell's gorgeous, soaring, expressive voice and either her acoustic guitar or her keyboards. It speaks to the album's absorbing power that most of us came to its best songs via covers by other artists. The rapturous For Free, the eco-friendly thumper Big Yellow Taxi, and the moody, nostalgic Woodstock, which in Mitchell's hands is actually spooky as hell. With its electric piano and slow warbling vocal performance, it's absolutely nothing like the more famously celebratory take from Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. More on them shortly. It's nothing like that. Ladies of the Canyon ends with a song called The Circle Game, a spirited love song with CSNY providing the backup vocals. There you go. More evidence of the community vibe in LA at the time.
You could rename that song The Circle Jerk Game, because pretty much what it was.
Okay. That's creative. Anyway, then again, that's only minor when you consider that Mitchell recorded the album in a house that she was sharing with CSNY's Graham Nash, with whom she was in a relationship with entering 1970. It's the same house that Graham Nash and his bandmates croon about on Our House, one of the many perfect songs on Deja Vu, the nearly perfect 1970 album that made its four members super duper rock stars earlier that year. Now, how's that for a transition, Arturo?
Well, my take on Joni Mitchell's Ladies of the Canyon, from Blue onward up until the end of the 1970s, Joni Mitchell's catalog is great. But before that, for the most part, is just whiny, mopey, continuously slow, just bedroom ballad bullshit with Joni whinging with her falsetto voice to the high heavens about her broken heart over and over again. She was
Yeah.
basically the Lana Del Rey of her time.
Yeah, it is a pretty intense record.
Yeah.
She's falsettoing the shit out of this record.
Yeah, I know. It's
Yeah.
annoying. It's really grating to listen to. That's why one of the many gifts, one of the great things about Blue is that she tones it down and she opens, and it's a little more authentic, and she opens herself up more. We'll get to the Blue discussion in the 1971 episode of this series, but for now, no, Ladies of the Canyon is just one overwrought, mostly piece of crap, except for one really great song. You mentioned it, Big Yellow Taxi, which is a really nice little folky shuffle. And it's basically her commentary against gentrification and how urbanization is killing out, natural land.
Yeah.
It's a really clever song, really catchy. And
Yeah.
really and really an engaging track, done very well by Counting Crows. And
Yeah,
I'm
I was
not
gonna
even.
say I actually like Counting Crows version better. Actually is pretty good. And then you gotta admit, Woodstock is a great song, although I don't like her rendition of it because it's
No,
like,
the CSNY version is way better.
yeah, like her version is almost creepy. It's
Yeah,
like, are you're supposed to be singing about a good time, aren't you?
right.
It doesn't sound like a very good time in her hands because
It is back in this period of Joni Mitchell's career. She makes anything, any sentiment, any emotion, any feeling, make it sound like I'm so sad.
Yeah,
I think every Joni
well,
Mitchell
she
song
makes
is.
it sound like Chinese water torture, and that's the thing, which on songs like For Free kind of works, but not you. But like I said, her version of Woodstock, and yeah, and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young brought the great song, it showed everybody that there was a great song there.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's talk a little bit now about Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. How did this grouping of two bona fide hippies, Crosby and Nash, and two bona fide control freaks, Stephen Stills and Neil Young, work exactly? Barely, actually, as the 18 months they spent as a foursome were rocky as hell, something
Yeah.
that David Brown also chronicles in his book Fire and Rain. There's no denying that the music they produced together on Deja Vu is classic stuff, though. Now, to back up a little bit, Crosby, Stills, and Nash first got together in 1968 after they flamed out of, respectively, the Byrds, the Hollies, and the Buffalo Springfield, finding instant chemistry and magic together in their three-part harmonies. The formation of CSN led to the release of a self-titled debut album in the summer of 1969. That album spawned several hits, including Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, which is a great Stephen Stills piece of music, and it put the band in position to dominate the pop landscape. Before they could, though, they bowed to record label pressure to expand its supergroupish footprint. Enter Neil Young, who had been a member of Buffalo Springfield with Stills. Now Young joined the expanded CSNY, even though there was the creative tension and battles for control between Stills and Young that had led to the Buffalo Springfield breakup. But hey, at least they were simpatico musically. Yeah, together, the four guys combined their songwriting and recording chops to create a truly special record in Deja Vu. All four really produced stunning moments on the album. There's Crosby belting out the psychedelic hippie anthem "Almost Cut My Hair," featuring a killer solo by Neil Young. There's Stills cranking out the amazing song "Sweet Carry On," which opens the album. There's Nash creating melodic nirvana on the lightweight but gorgeous Our House,
Hmm.
and Young fashioning the tender country rock of Helpless.
Hmm.
Young also proves he can hang with the others as a harmony vocalist on the title track and on the cover of Mitchell's Woodstock. Meanwhile, bassist Greg Reeves and drummer Dallas Taylor give the proceedings a firm backbone, giving Young and Stills ample space to jam the hell out of the lead guitar through the album. And so in 1970, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young provided us with one of rock's great what could have beens.
Yeah.
Imagine a career full of albums like Deja Vu coming from those guys, or more songs like the standalone single Ohio, an impassioned outrage response to the aforementioned Kent State shootings written by Young with the help from Crosby. Alas, it was not meant to be, as the egos and chaotic personal lives of the group members ensured that things fell apart rather quickly. Young segued later in 1970 back to a solo career. More on that in a bit. And the other three guys continued a 4 decades long, off again, on again, off again, on again band relationship, though Young himself also came back a time or two. But at least we got Deja Vu out of him. And 1970 was better for it. For what it's worth, the album reached #1 with a bullet upon its release in March of 1970 and is certified 7 times platinum by the Recording Industry Association of America. Arturo, your thoughts on Deja Vu?
I love it. The Crosby, Stills and Nash, the trio album that came out the year before is pretty good, and there's some great songs on there. But it's a little, how can I say this? It's lacking in balls, and that's what Neil Young gives the group. He gave them their balls, and you see it on full display. See the balls, I guess, on full display. You can hear the balls on full display in Deja Vu. There's more grit, there's more backbone to the songs. They're more grounded, and he doesn't just he adds a bit to. I mean, he doesn't need to add much vocally to the CSN sound. But he definitely adds much needed musical backbone and guitar work to the CSN sound, making it CSNY.
Oh yeah, yes. I mean his soloing on Almost Cut My Hair is kick ass.
Stephen Stills is a wonderful guitar player, especially on the acoustic guitar, but he doesn't have the distinctive electric guitar sound, never had it, that Neil Young has. And of course, Neil Young is probably a better songwriter than any of those three put together. No offense, CSN, but it's true. And you hear it on this record.
Well, there's no probably about it. I mean, the best written song on the record by a mile is Helpless. And that's on an album with Almost Cut My Hair and Deja Vu and Our House and Teach Your Children Well and a whole bunch of, like, one great song after another. Helpless is like the standout track for sure. So a few minutes back, in quoting David Brown from Fire and Rain, I named Cat Stevens as a beneficiary of the soft rock movement. Here is another artist who experienced a major breakout during 1970. Amazingly, this dude wasn't even from L.A. Stevens
sounds like he might have. He sounds like he might have.
Yeah, he might have been. Yeah, he sounds like it. But he actually was a Londoner. He was a guy named. He was born Stephen Georgiou, whose career started in his late teens during the 1960s. Initially, he was packaged as a Beatles-inspired slick popper. The early Cat Stevens catalog managed to be both bland and overwrought. Quite an unintentional accomplishment if you think about it. The main positive byproduct of those first 3 albums is the presence of The First Cut is the Deepest, which was covered ably over the years by Rod Stewart, Sheryl Crow, and a host of other artists. But then 1969 happens to Cat Stevens, and his disposition both in life and in music changed. Not only did he endure a painful romantic breakup, but he also battled a severe case of tuberculosis, spending months in the hospital. The combo turned Stevens' sensitivity jets up to the max, and he started to find his inner yogi and its lilting soft rock voice. Keep in mind that Stevens converted to hardcore Islam by the end of the 70s, changing his name to Yusuf Islam, and doing basically doing Islamic music for the better part of 35 years before he returned to pop. But anyway, by November 1970, Cat Stevens had introduced That Cat Stevens, the testosterone-challenged acoustic ditty version, to the world with his hit album Tea for the Tillerman. The album is most famous for its monster hit Wild World, which for decades has lived in ubiquity in several light music radio formats. Other notable tracks on Tea for the Tillerman are the beautiful album opener Where Do the Children Play, the rougher yet somehow still beautiful follow-up Hard-Headed Woman, and the delectably British folk ballad Father and Son, in which Stevens's alto and baritone registers engage in a dialectic. It's a neat trick on an album full of them. Tea for the Tillerman reached number 8 on the Billboard 200 album chart and is certified 3 times platinum by the RIAA. Ironically, the album didn't do anywhere near as well in Stevens's native UK, where the music of the moment in 1970 veered towards amped up blues rock rather than the granola in the fields vibe of the US. Go figure. Arturo,
I'm going to quote Robert Christgau and
go ahead.
his review, his two sentence review of Tea for the Tillerman. Quote, my big problems with this record are no doubt why it's a hit. The artificially ripened singing, which goes down like a store-bought banana daiquiri, and the insufferable sexist condescension of Wild World. B minus.
Yeah,
Personally,
he's
yeah,
pretty right. Cat Stevens was probably the most testosterone-free misogynist in the history of rock and roll.
yeah, yeah, and he became a Muslim. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, I was gonna
Anyway,
say. Yeah,
but this album is about two songs, Father and Son, which is really a beautiful song
yeah.
and a really touching, moving song, and of course the really big hit Wild World, which is a great track.
Yeah,
Despite
I also do like Where Do the Children Play? That's a good song, and that was a modest hit back in the day as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah,
yeah. So like if James Taylor's Sweet Baby James is all about that one track, Joni Mitchell's Ladies for the Canyon is all about that one track. This is all about these two songs.
yeah. I mean, and that's pretty much the case. So anyway, we cannot end this discussion of the 1970s soft rock revolution without intoning once again Neil Young. Young's take on the quote unquote soft rock genre was louder and more emotive than the output of his peers, which makes calling it soft rock a bit of an insulting misnomer.
Right.
Even so, no one did this shtick better than Young in 1970. Even if we just kept the discussion to Helpless and Country Girl from Deja Vu and to Ohio, that might still hold true. But Young's solo masterpiece from 1970, released late in the year after the Gold Rush, was released in August, puts him over the top. The album, which supposedly started life as the soundtrack to an ultimately unproduced film by actor Dean Stockwell, is both strange and strangely beautiful. I'd say it's one of the most singular albums in the entire rock canon. There's nothing else that quite sounds like that album. Young sings in an aching, almost alien falsetto that pumps real pathos into songs like Birds and the title track. He's also not afraid to turn up the volume, taking Southern Man and When You Dance I Can Really Love, which would work wonderfully as heartfelt solo acoustic numbers, to glorious heights as Crazy Horse bash outs. But what makes After the Gold Rush special ultimately is an unclassifiable mystery and cosmic touch that somehow makes the weirdest of songs formally, like Only Love Can Break Your Heart and Don't Let It Bring You Down, into the most accessible of heartacres. Neil just had it in capital letters and quotes, and it pours out all over the fucking place on After the Gold Rush. Put that in your soft pot rock pipe and smoke at everyone else. Arturo,
Absolutely. Yeah.
what do you
I
say?
mean, aside from CSNY's Deja Vu, this album blows away all those others and is
Yeah.
better than all of them put together.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, the thing with Neil is that yeah, he had that versatility. He could do the acoustic folk music better than anyone else, almost anyone else. He could do the wistful, whiny, mopey piano ballad stuff better than anyone else. And he could rock as well as anyone else. Anyone who wants to claim that either Leonard Cohen or Joni Mitchell is Canada's greatest songwriter, fuck you. Go listen to
Yeah.
Neil Young and shut up.
Yeah. Oh no, I agree. And hey, don't forget about Geddy Lee.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
And Neil Peart.
he comes much later in the timeline.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. But you can't diss Canada totally. So anyway, moving on. So that's the soft rock. The other, I think, big headline story of 1970, inarguably, besides the soft rock revolution, is the dissolution of the Beatles and the coming of the solo Beatles canon, where John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison all released arguably classic albums in 1970. Arturo, you're going to talk to us about those records, correct?
Yeah, when the Beatles officially broke up in spring of 1970, speculation was rampant as to what each of them would do with their solo careers. The three main songwriting Beatles, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison, would go on to release solo debuts that were so widely and vastly different from each other that it's really impossible to imagine any of these songs coexisting on an album under the Beatles' name. Lennon's and Harrison's debut albums were especially deeply personal and full of the kind of artistic intent and intensity that could only be solo albums. So let's go into the 3 solo Beatle debut albums. First, John Lennon, Plastic Ono Band. Before we delve into this record, it's important to note that in February of 1970, Lennon released a standalone single called Instant Karma that was a massive worldwide top 10 hit. It sold 1 million copies, went number 3 in the US, number 2 in Canada, number 5 in the UK, and top 10 all over Europe as well as Australia. If you don't think you've heard it, yes, you have. We all shine on like the moon and the stars and the sun. It's the kind of powerful, rousing, anthemic pop song that only Lennon could write, showing off his genius talent for taking heartfelt sentiments that would be trite and corny in any other songwriter's hands, namely Paul McCartney's, and raise them to the level of universal truths and imbue them with depth and meaning. Seriously, no one then or now did that better than John Lennon. Instant Karma is also by far one of the 10 most enduring, timelessly classic, and all-time greatest solo Beatles tracks, one that has aged like fine wine and will live forever. Contrary to all the John haters and McCartney lovers out there, this was the first of several solo hits that Lennon would have throughout the 1970s. So do not let it be said that he struggled throughout his solo career.
No, he didn't.
It was
Yeah, that is
it-
bullshit. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. It was in the afterglow of such commercial and artistic success that Lennon went into the studio to record his proper solo debut album. 2 things need to be noted before anyone attempts to appreciate this masterpiece of a record. First, throughout much of 1970, Lennon underwent serious and rigorous psychotherapy with the renowned psychologist Arthur Janov, most well known for his practice of scream therapy. Judging from the profundity of the album's lyrical content, it seemed to do Lennon a world of good. What a lot of people don't realize when they consider the individual Beatles' personalities is that Lennon was the only one of the 4 who suffered from a great deal of emotional and psychological trauma growing up as a kid. He was an only child. He was abandoned by his father, and his mother's sisters forced his mom to give him up because they thought Julia, John's mom, wasn't a suitable mother. As a result, he was raised by his stern Aunt Mimi. And just when Lennon was reestablishing a relationship with his mother, when he reached his teens, she died in a car accident. Therefore, he lost his mom twice, if you think about it. It's no wonder the man had mommy issues and craved a mothering figure all throughout his life. As someone who went through psychotherapy for many years himself, I can sympathize, if not empathize, with someone who wanted to work on themselves and get out the anxiety, grief, trauma, and pain that they carried all their lives. Second, contrary to the album title, Yoko Ono is nowhere on this record. It's Lennon on vocals, guitars, and piano, Ringo Starr on drums, and Klaus Voormann on bass. That's it. It's a rather Spartan, sparse, stark lineup, and the music that resulted from it reflected it perfectly. Listening to it now, 54 years later, and it's startling how bold, brave, and frankly heroic it was of Lennon to put this album out. This has nowhere near the commercial appeal of even the Beatles' most experimental work. Because it had his name on it, Plastic Ono Band debuted in the top 10 of album charts all around the world, but it yielded no hit singles and didn't stay on the charts for long. Critics, though, praised it to high heaven, and to this day it stands in the discussion for best solo Beatle album ever and regularly shows up in any and all music media lists of the greatest albums of all time. In my opinion, it is by far and away the greatest solo Beatle album of all time, one of the top 100 albums ever made. Why is that? Well, first, there's the haunting, skeletal sound of the record. It takes the art rock inclinations of Lennon's White Album songs and takes them to the next level. The space in the music creates a mood that's just as musical as the notes that he and the band play. That sense of space combined with the thin, compressed production of the instruments presents a sound that was so utterly unique and almost revolutionary at the time, one that hadn't been heard before, or at least not been heard on such a high-profile pop record. It's a sound that would prove to be deeply influential on the stark gray sounds of the subgenre of post-punk and eventually on subgenres such as alternative and indie rock. Susie and the Banshees, Public Image Limited, Joy Division, Bauhaus, David Bowie's late 1970s Berlin trilogy, the Pixies, Guided by Voices, the Strokes, they all owe a debt to the sound world Lennon created on this album. Second, there's the songwriting itself and Lennon's anguished, harrowing lyrics. I mentioned how uncommercial this record is, and it indeed is therapy put to music. But man, oh man, therapy has never sounded this immediate, this bracing, and frankly, this well-crafted. You start with Mother, his painful admission of yearning for the parents he never had, and you nearly end with God, Lennon stripping away of all the things that used to mean something to him but don't anymore, including the Beatles themselves. You have Working Class Hero, Lennon's scathing indictment of the Western class system, where the working classes are expected to rise up and become middle class, thereby buying and settling into the capitalist dream, not knowing that they're just expected to contribute to the system that keeps the rich in power and, well, rich. It's about the repressive nature of institutional power, is what that song really is about. Good luck finding a Paul McCartney song that delves into such weighty issues. There are stark, piercing guitar rockers like Well, Well, Well and I Found Out. And there are touching, tender moments such as Love and My Mummy's Dead. And third, it's Lennon's voice itself. Rarely before with the Beatles and never afterward would Lennon use his voice in such an overwhelmingly emotional way, cutting into his own words and trying to find the damaged heart and scarred soul inside of them. He may not have had the best vocal range of the Beatles, that would have been McCartney, but he was by far the most sincerely soulful singer the Beatles had, the one who lived in and felt the lyrics the most. It's a genius talent he utilized to perfection on Plastic Ono Band. There's very little more I can add to this deeply resonant, emotionally walloping, sometimes disturbing masterpiece of a record. This could never have been a Beatles album, and we as listeners and fans are all the better for it. Chris?
Yeah, and very few of the songs probably could have worked as Beatles songs. I mean, maybe Mother, maybe Well, Well, Well. Could have worked, but yeah, this was Lennon kind of declaring, this was his declaration of independence, and it really is an incredible album. It's strangely beautiful because of that sparseness, and and featuring like Lennon's, like I said, Lennon's voice had it was dripping with pathos, a lot of character to it. It's worth noting, and one of the more interesting things about this record is that it was produced by Phil Spector.
Yeah.
And so Spector kind of proves what kind of a talent he is.
But here's the thing, though. If you read about it, Spector's name is on the production, but it's really ghost produced by John Lennon. Because Lennon's fingerprints are on this record. Like Phil Spector was known to be a bully with his artists.
Mm-hmm.
He couldn't get away with that with John Lennon, you know. And produced by Spector, but it's more of a co-production.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I mean, there's a legend that I've read that that a couple years later, Spector put a gun in Lennon's mouth at the studio over some dispute. That's
kind
know.
of that's a fairy tale.
Yeah,
the gun he pulled on the Ramones is true because that's been corroborated.
Yeah, but the whole thing though, it's, Spector, for him to be able to use a minimalist template in place of his usual maximal template, because you got to remember that year his production hatchet job of Let It Be was introduced to the world, where he put all those freaking overdubs on Across the Universe and The Long and Winding Road and et cetera, and he just kind of embarrassed himself there. But he comes back here and is able to do that stripped to the bone sound that Lennon wanted. and to pull it off and to engineer it as well as he did, I mean, that it's definitely worth mentioning and worth talking about and worth celebrating.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, the next solo Beatle album, Paul McCartney with his album McCartney. Maybe I'm Amazed is the standout track from McCartney's solo debut album, and it's easy to see why. It's a classic Paul ballad with a lovely verse melody, a rousing chorus, his patented Little Richard inspired vocalizations, and a gospel hymn feeling, not unlike Let It Be. It was a pretty big hit, going top 10 in both the US and Canada, yet strangely stalling at number 28 in the UK. The rest of the album, well, I'll be blunt. It's an atrocious piece of shit. One thing is going for a lo-fi, unadorned, unproduced, demo-like sound to evoke the freshness of creating music in the moment. Another thing is when such a sound is utilized to frame a set of underdeveloped, half-baked, glorified children's songs with god-awful lyrics full of trite, corny, goofball sentiment. Compared to how John Lennon expertly used minimalism and stark instrumentation to craft a major personal and artistic statement, McCartney's attempt at something similar just rings hollow and sounds shallow and uninspired. Thankfully, McCartney would rebound the following year. Chris?
Yeah, he did. He definitely rebounded. I actually don't mind this record too much. And what's impressive about it is that McCartney plays all the instruments himself. And so what he manages to do and what makes the album engaging, like you said, maybe I'm Amazed is by far the best song on the record. But what makes it impressive is he's basically doing a musical impression of John, George, and Ringo.
Yeah.
And it kind of, he does one better on Ringo on drums, and he proves to be a better guitarist, I think, than George. And so his technical chops as a technical accomplishment of him, like literally doing everything. He made the entire
Can't
record.
quite duplicate Lennon though.
No, can't wait. Yeah, not as a vocalist or but basically, everyone else he manages to kind of parrot and capture them, and so it's almost like McCartney doing his version of a Beatles record by playing all four Beatles.
Right.
And I think that's kind of a nifty accomplishment. He produced the record. He did it himself on his farm in the early part of the late '69, early 1970, working on that. And basically, the release of the record was his way of breaking up the Beatles.
Mm.
Yeah, that he I think it was the day of him
Right.
dropping McCartney.
Right.
That he announced the breakup of the Beatles, and so
Yeah.
that's a neat trick to pull
Yeah.
on bandmates that hate you.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
And the album got critically vilified. Critics
yeah,
hated this when it came out. But hey,
yeah,
Maybe I'm Amazed is a great song.
yeah.
All right. So we move on to the next solo Beatle, George Harrison, All Things Must Pass. When Harrison released this triple album behemoth in the fall of 1970, it really was him emptying the vault of all the songs he had written up until then, many of them dating back to the White Album era, and many of them having been rejected as Beatles songs by the band's Lennon-McCartney songwriting nexus. If there ever was an album, though, that justified its triple album status, it's this one. Even the third disc, the one full of instrumental jam sessions and cheesy joke music, even that has its charms. Starting in 1968, Harrison cleared the psychedelic fog of the previous couple of years' Indian fixations and really came into his own as a songwriter, explicitly evident in the clutch of amazing songs he penned for both the White Album and Abbey Road. That creative burst continued into the new decade, and pretty much all the solo songs Harrison would ever be known for spread out among the first two discs of this album. My Sweet Lord may be the most blissfully beautiful religious song to ever be a worldwide hit single, even if it blatantly stole the chorus melody from the Chiffons' 1963 hit, He's So Fine. Harrison eventually lost a big chunk of the royalties of this song in court, and the whole case reportedly shot his confidence as a songwriter for years. But there are other gems for old George to be proud of. What Is Life is the other massive hit from this album, and is essentially a massive slab of Stax label Southern soul, given producer Phil Spector's massive wall of sound treatment. The lyrics to Isn't It a Pity can be a bit sanctimonious and self-righteous, as much of Harrison's lyrics are, if one has to be honest, but it's rendered moot by the epic, beautiful melancholy that the song is soaked in. Awaiting on You, the other blatantly religious song on the record, is stirring, authentic gospel, while behind that locked door shows how well Harrison could do stirring, aching country music. Ballad of Frankie Crisp as one of the most lovely piano motifs any of the Beatles ever came up with, while Art of Dying is a stunning slice of, believe it or not, proto-disco. The range of styles and scope of artistic ambition on All Things Must Pass is pretty breathtaking, and it's no wonder the album was both a commercial blockbuster and a critical success on its release. In the pantheon of solo Beatle albums, I put this at a firm number 3. Chris?
For me, it would be a close number 2 to Plastic Ono Band. I love All Things Must Pass. And it's the liberation of George Harrison. Could you imagine being one of the best songwriters in the world, but being the third best songwriter in your own band?
Yeah.
And how torturous that must have been. And so he gets a chance to release all these records that he had and songs he had been working on the previous 2 or 3 years. And it's liberating. And you didn't mention Wah Wah, which is another which is another great fun song that with Clapton jamming on guitar. Just really, really good stuff. And also there's that great cover, If Not For You, by Bob Dylan,
right,
where he plays with the kind of weird slide guitar thing. And so that's neat as well. So yeah, so I've always enjoyed that record. I mean, and I do like that third disc that has all the jamming on it. Just some really, really, really fun stuff. And so yeah, Harrison, it's weird. It's like he blew his whole load on that one record, and then he went downhill.
Yeah, he never did anything nowhere near as good as this album afterwards. Anyone who says, "Oh, I love George Harrison's music," have you listened to any George Harrison music after All Things Must Pass? I think you'd change your mind if you did.
Yeah, he had that one song that came out a couple years later. Give me peace, give me hope, give me peace on earth. But which is okay. I mean, basically, it was like a retread of My Sweet Lord.
I will admit 33 1/3, his album from 1976, is not bad. That's okay. That's a pretty good record.
Yeah, and his Cloud 9 record from, I think it's called Cloud 9, from 1987 is okay. Yeah. That's got a couple of decent pop hits on it. And then he actually did some decent work with the Traveling Wilburys too. So it wasn't all atrocious. But basically, he blew his load all at once. He was so happy to be out of the Beatles that he just gave everything he had, and then that was it.
Yeah. So this is your second Beatles solo album, huh?
That's this is my second solo Beatles.
You're number 2. Okay.
Yeah, and then number 3 is everything else.
Okay. So you have number 1. So you're number 1, Plastic Ono Band. 2, All Things Must Pass. 3, everything else.
Well, three might probably Ram by McCartney.
Ram, I have it as 4. I have it as number 4. My number 3 is I have number 1, Plastic Ono. Number 2, Imagine, which we're going to talk about in the next episode of the series. Mm-hmm. Number 3, All Things Must Pass. Number 4, Ram.
Yeah. So yeah, that's about it. But again,
No. Sorry. No, number 4, Band on the Run is number 4 for me.
Yeah, Band on the Run is pretty good as well. I'll admit, nowhere near. Ram is by far McCartney's best solo record, though.
On this episode, we visited 1970 in our second golden age of rock series. For the next episode, we're transporting 30 years into the future to revisit our shit series. That's right, we're going to put the curmudgeon in the Curmudgeon Rock Report by ripping a new one on one of this podcast's least favorite bands, Arcade Fire. Their star has diminished a bit in the past decade, and they haven't released anything in a while. But that doesn't take away from the fact that starting in 2004, they were for about a decade the de facto band of choice for obnoxious, pretentious, indie hipster douchebags. It wouldn't have been so bad if Arcade Fire's music wasn't the epitome of bloated, indulgent, self-important, self-aggrandizing, overly theatrical, overly sentimental indie pop slop trying to pass itself as indie rock. Their posturing made U2 seem humble and modest by comparison. Yeah, we really don't like this band. Join us next time as we break down their excruciatingly bad 5-album discography as the Curmudgeon Rock Report brings you Why Arcade Fire Are Shit.
Shall we move on?
We shall move on. Now we go to James Brown, who changes the game again with a leaner, meaner, grittier, even more stripped down version of the funk that he already invented. Chris, tell us about it.
The star of the show, hardworking Mr. Dynamite, James Brown, as he's referred to at the beginning of his album Sex Machine. So anyway, James Brown revolutionized music, all of it, with the introduction of The One in the late 1960s. Songs like Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, Cold Sweat, and Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud moved the rhythm to the front and center, literally creating funk music as we know it by putting the emphasis on the first and third beats of a 4-beat measure rather than the second and the fourth. Because of funk, the earth and the heavens both moved, warped by the will of one James Brown, musical genius. But all of that prior to 1970 turned out to be primitive. Brown had not yet refined his formula to be truly sexy, truly sensually, and truly aggressively lean and mean. That progression came in the form of Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine, an unbelievably great recording Brown dropped on an unsuspecting world in the summer of 1970. Brown introduced a preternaturally talented new backing band, the JBs, to help him fully unleash the power of the funk. The JBs drove The One hard, thanks to the competing guitar and bass riffs of brothers Catfish and Bootsy Collins. Theirs was a propulsion that inspired Brown and backup singer Bobby Byrd to their most salaciously horny heights. With Byrd's repetitive, nearly hypnotic vocal motif of Get On Up, freeing Brown to grunt and yell and practically scream for orgasmic release. Now, Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine is one of the only pieces of popular music I know that is capable of producing a thrill roughly on par with the first time I heard it, every time I hear it, including tonight, a mere 3 hours before we hit record on this episode. The song reached the number 2 on the Billboard R&B chart and number 15 on the Hot 100 singles chart.
How can it not go to number 1? How did that not go number 1?
I don't know. And it comes in at number 196 on Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest songs of all time.
Way too low.
Yeah, exactly. Now, the single was actually one of 2 recorded versions that Brown released in 1970 of Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine. The second version, which rages on for a full 11 minutes, is part of a 5-song, quote-unquote, recorded live in the studio suite that begins the album Sex Machine, which otherwise is an actual live album and one of the best ever released at that. It's a feat of engineering magic that Brown and company managed to meld those first 5 songs, which received overdubbed audience cheering and a significant boost in reverb, with the rest of the actual live recording so seamlessly. If you didn't know the beginning part of Sex Machine wasn't part of the real show, you truly would not know. Now, regardless of whether it's 100% live or not, Sex Machine does stand as a testament to the James Brown experience and what it had morphed into by 1970. From the racing congas rumbling underneath I Got the Feeling, to Brown's delicious organ soloing on a cover of Blood, Sweat, and Tears' Spinning Wheel, to the manic rhythm guitar that drives Please, 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 to the nasty-ass drum breaks and horn riffs on closer Mother Popcorn, Brown and his bandmates are a motherfucking show on Sex Machine. Theirs was one of the most singular offerings in music history, and this album chronicles it wonderfully. They weren't just playing the funk by this point, they were flat out living it. Really, truly the nastiest of the nasty. Long live Sex Machine, both the song and the album. Arturo, what say you?
Yeah, I mean, I echo the same sentiments. I mean, people talk about James Brown's Live at the Apollo 1963.
Oh, which is great.
Which is great. Dude, the Sex Machine live album from 1970 is way, 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 way better. Um,
I wouldn't go that far, but
I think it's way better, dude. I love the Live at the Apollo, but this is light years ahead. This is one of the 10 greatest live albums ever made, and it should be on anyone's list. And
although, I mean, unofficially, because you got to remember those first five songs, and it's a neat trick. That's actually a studio jam session
yeah, live in the studio.
yeah, with overdubbed crowd noise,
Yeah,
and
there you
then
go.
starting from track six, it becomes a live album.
Right. So, but yeah, it's fantastic. It's if I were including live albums, quote unquote, or semi live albums in my greatest albums of all time, this would easily be top 50 for me.
Yeah, well, there you go. There you go. And so now we move on from James Brown, who again was at the absolute zenith of black music. Now we go to just like witches in black masses. Namely,
Hey,
we go from black music to Black Sabbath.
exactly.
Arturo, tell us about the dawn of the first true bona fide heavy metal band, which I guess I'll
Yeah.
agree with.
Yeah.
And their first two albums, Black Sabbath and Paranoid.
Right. Our contemporary ears and sensibilities have learned to take Black Sabbath for granted. If you're a Gen X person or a younger a younger person of either millennial or Gen Z, Black Sabbath have always been there, an omnipresent, ubiquitous force in rock music, the fathers of heavy metal, the look, the sound, Tony Iommi's guitar riffs as ingrained in our consciousness as Christmas carols, Ozzy Osbourne's persona as marketable as Mickey Mouse, especially after the hugely successful reality TV series The Osbournes. That's why it's really hard for us now who weren't alive in 1970 to understand how radical and frankly revolutionary Black Sabbath's sound was when it was unleashed with their self-titled debut album in the spring of that year. Jimi Hendrix and Cream simultaneously laid down the foundations and building blocks for what would become heavy metal 3 years earlier. And 2 years after that, Led Zeppelin would further define its look and sound with a punishingly heavy form of blues rock. When Black Sabbath emerged from the English Midlands capital of Birmingham, they were an entirely different proposition altogether. Both Cream and Zeppelin were from London, big city boy sophisticates compared to the strictly working class background devoid of formal education that the four members of Black Sabbath came from. For the record, by the way, two of Zeppelin's members, Robert Plant and John Bonham, also came from near Birmingham and weren't too far away from Black Sabbath as far as socioeconomic status went. Oddly enough, though, Black Sabbath started out as a somewhat heavy blues rock band called Earth. And according to various interviews given by Ozzy Osbourne and other Sabbath members, their look and sound weren't too different from the hippie-scented blues rock that numerous other bands in the UK were involved with at the time. But such was the influence of Led Zeppelin on the young Earth that once they settled on the core quartet that would make up the band, they had changed their sound into something beyond what even Led Zeppelin was doing. Credit the copious amounts of marijuana that they were consuming at the time. Credit the very brief interest in black magic and the occult that bassist and chief lyricist Geezer Butler was involved in throughout 1969 and that he would very soon abandon. Or credit the don't give a fuck attitude that a pack of working class chancers desperate to be successful would have. Either way, the appearance of Black Sabbath was the first time that the look, sound, and ethos of what we now know as heavy metal was fully represented. Tony Iommi's guitar riffs weren't just heavy, they were gigantic slabs of sludge, proudly lacking in any kind of subtlety that beat you over the head mercilessly.
Down-tuned motherfuckers.
Exactly. In Butler and drummer Bill Ward, they had a rhythm section that wasn't just awesomely heavy. They had a subtle jazz swing that offset the ominous heaviness of the guitars. In Ozzy Osbourne, they had a lead singer who visually didn't give a shit about putting on a show for the crowd. Nope. He put on a show for himself, standing still to deliver his bellowing vocals, and when not doing that, violently dancing to his own demented beat, virtually inventing the heavy metal trope of headbanging as we know it. And of course, there's the appropriation of satanic imagery that they became equally known for. In reality, not a single member of the band was a Satanist or even into the occult, except for Butler for a brief time before he went back to being a practicing Catholic, or as much of a practicing Catholic as a touring, coke snorting rocker can be. This was the classic show business case of an entertainer taking the images, symbols, and tropes of something in order to draw controversy to themselves and further their career. None of this would have meant anything, though, if the music wasn't so groundbreaking and vitally influential. In addition to giving birth to heavy metal, the classic Sabbath sound of the first half of the 1970s would go on to become a pivotal influence on various subgenres of rock: alternative rock, grunge, goth metal, stoner metal, post rock, post metal, you name it. And it was with their first two albums, both released in 1970, that Black Sabbath got the ball rolling. Let's start with the first one, self-titled Black Sabbath. When you start the album out with the first track, the title track, and the drums come crashing down, and Tony Iommi's guitar riff evokes the three-note tritone known as the Diabolus in Musica, a three-note progression associated with Satanism dating back to the Middle Ages. You all know it. Dun, dun, dun. You know you're in for one hell of an ominous song. Inspired by bassist Geezer Butler's true story, where he, quote unquote, claims he was visited by a dark apparition late at night while he was sleeping, Sabbath twisted into a song of the devil dragging someone's soul down to the depths of hell as the track swells into a metal monster of overpowering riffage. While Led Zeppelin were known for evoking J.R.R. Tolkien's fantasy novels, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, with folk rock songs, Ramble On, Straight Up Folk, The Battle of Evermore, and groovy soul rock, Misty Mountain Hop, Sabbath do so on this record with The Wizard, a pulverizing slab of authentic metal with surprisingly jazzy rhythm breaks. The standout track, of course, is Basically, with two S's, segueing into NIB, where a studio-manipulated Geezer Butler bass solo transitions into an overpowering piece of righteous sludge metal, having one of Iommi's most iconic riffs. Despite the back end of the record having some sloppy improvisations and show-offy, Cream-esque endless soloing, something the band would more than rectify on their next album, Black Sabbath, the album, is a pioneering album in the history of rock and roll, an album where heavy metal is finally presented in its formalized, idealized form. The formula would be perfected in Black Sabbath's next few albums. Chris?
Yeah, this album is corny. It's the thing about it. I mean, I love NIB,
Yeah.
and obviously, that riff, and this is where we thank God that Iommi only had like 4 3/4 fingers
Yeah.
on that hand, and that kind of led to that tone and that tuning that he used, and so full effect on NIB. For sure, great stuff. And then obviously, I do like the title track, Black Sabbath. Where it has that the sound effect with the lightning, the thunder and lightning, and then the whole drama. It's like pure Beavis and Butthead shit. But yeah, I mean, mostly though, it is kind of a corny record. It's a little bit more cartoony than the other stuff. Now Geezer Butler, they were not a Satanist band. If anything, their stuff that went on that they did from Paranoid on was kind of like, Christ is the good guy in those songs, and it's like the dark forces that are at war against Christ, and so people need to just sort of listen to it with those ears, that it's not the devil that's winning, it's Christ that's ultimately winning, but but the dark forces are there. On this record, it's more sort of I don't know, ghouls and goblins kind of shit. And so I've never been a huge fan of the record itself, but I'll admit it is groundbreaking because of the innovations of the sound and the aesthetic, especially the aesthetic.
Right. Next, Black Sabbath, the album Paranoid.
Wonderful
Black,
album.
yeah, Black Sabbath's second album was not just a gigantic leap forward from their debut, but it's a seminal moment in rock history and one of the most important albums in the history of 20th century music. Why? Because it's arguably, not arguably in my opinion, the single greatest and most influential heavy metal album of all time. Black Sabbath's debut album was the first metal album, but this is the album that everything heavy metal related that came afterward was directly inspired and affected by, and in some cases, straight up ripped off. The
Most
album's huge,
cases.
yeah, most cases. The album's huge commercial success in both the UK and Europe, as well as the US, is a testament to that fact. Three of the band's most iconic songs, indeed, three of the most iconic songs in the entire rock canon, are on this album. The buzzsaw, proto-punk, adrenaline rush of the title track, the tension-filled anti-war riff monolith that is War Pigs, and then there's Iron Man, the epic tale of apocalyptic revenge with a brontosaurus riff to devour them all and shifting dynamics throughout the track that proves the underrated, rock solid, and versatile musicianship of the Iommi Butler Ward axis. Throw in the drug casualty tale of the brooding, intense Hand of Doom and the left field tender jazzy ballad Planet Caravan, and you get not just a heavy metal tour de force, but an album full of varying textures, stylistic departures, lyrical power, and shout it from the mountaintop rock power. Considering the level of sheer innovation and massive, almost incalculable influence this album had on the next 50 years of music, this is, to me, undoubtedly the best album of 1970. Chris?
Yeah, I would say it's up there for me. I think Plastic Ono Band overall is probably the best album that was released in 1970, but this is pretty close. Uh, I've always admired this record for a couple reasons. One, the drumming on it is absolutely kick-ass. Bill Ward is probably the best metal drummer of all time. Uh, there's very few people that compete with him. I mean, maybe there's Lars Ulrich, but he's kind of in a different category. But Bill Ward, because of that jazz
Right.
influence, just there's something kind of cool about some of the stuff, especially like War Pigs, and then my favorite song on the record, which is Jack the Stripper and Fairies Wear Boots. Uh, I mean, the goofier Sabbath was, the better they were, and they just rock balls hard, and Iommi's soloing on this record is killer too. Yeah,
Yeah.
that he had really kind of, even between albums, had grown as a guitarist, and his soloing is just killer. Strange but true, by the way. It's worth mentioning that Tony Iommi's band before Earth and Black Sabbath was Jethro Tull.
Yeah, he was very very
Yeah,
briefly.
for one album, was a member of Jethro Tull in, what is it, 1968, I believe it
68,
was.
and in the Rolling Stones rock and roll circus concert film where they have a bunch of bands playing and then the Stones come on later, you see Tony Iommi with Jethro Tull.
Yeah, it talk about your strange marriages right there. Tony Iommi and what's his name, Ian Anderson.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, Paranoid is just Hand of Doom is awesome. War Pigs awesome. Iron Man obviously is awesome. It's a quintessential, it's the stereotypical metal record, and for good reason, because it's just special the way it's done. Everything about it is special.
All right. Speaking of special, this is one of the most special albums ever made in the history of rock. One of my personal favorites of all time. But Chris, you're going to take the lead on it. Gimme Danger, little stranger.
Yep, absolutely. We're talking about the Stooges' Funhouse, which is definitely one of the more unusual and coolest records ever made for a lot of reasons. We'll get into this. The best thing we can say about the Stooges' 1970 masterwork Funhouse is that it is raw as hell.
Yeah.
This is the most primal of rock and roll records, stripped of all pretense and hammered out at a consistently tense and intense pace over the course of the 37 most taut minutes you may ever spend on first listen. The Stooges go deep into the dark corners of the rock and roll mind and then proceed to go deeper. They make a 3.5 minute song like Loose feel like a 25-minute long psychedelic therapy session. You can only imagine what they do to a 7-minute blues romp like Dirt. Iggy Pop and the Ashton brothers took rock and roll to a place very few artists would ever go on Funhouse. It was a perfect way to building on the promise of their banging but arguably undercooked self-titled debut album from 1969. Part of the trick was a fateful decision by producer Don Gallucci to make this studio album as unstudio as possible.
It was basically recorded live in the studio, basically.
Yeah, but not just that, but this is an ironic thing considering that Gallucci was hired by the Stooges record executives to make the band more commercially accessible. And Gallucci did, in fact, make the album as literally as unstudio as possible, going so far as to strip the soundproofing from the walls and getting rid of all the other sound filtering equipment, and took all of that away, and it freed the band up to just play into the wider, more imagination-inducing space. The drums on Funhouse practically rattle as much as they bop or keep time. The guitars sound like they're raging from down the street into a dungy, marijuana smoke-filled basement in a serial killer's house. And then there's the saxophone solos on the songs 1970 and the title track, which stand as one of the most ingeniously zany touches on any album ever. There's a reason the great rock critic Greg Kot refers to Funhouse as punk jazz, after all.
Yeah.
Now, there's another rock critic out there who puts Funhouse in its proper perspective. Guess who, Arturo?
I can't imagine who.
We're talking, of course, about Robert Christgau. I've officially stolen your gimmick. This is 2 episodes in a row. This is what Robert Christgau in his Consumer Guide had to say about Funhouse. Quote, "Now I regret all the times I've used words like power and energy to describe rock and roll, because this is what such rhetoric should have been saved for. Shall I compare it to an atom bomb, a wrecker's ball, a hydroelectric plant? Language wasn't designed for the job. Yet despite its sonic impact, I find that the primary appeal of the music is not physical. I have to be in a certain mood of desperate abandon before it reaches my body. It always interests me intellectually, though, with its repetitiveness beyond the call of incompetence and its solitary new thing saxophone. This is genuinely avant-garde rock. The proof is the old avant-garde fallacy of L.A. blues, trying to make art about chaos by reproducing same. A minus."
That's pretty accurate.
Yeah, I like that. Trying to make art about chaos by reproducing same. A minus. Arturo, now, the thing about this record is it's hugely influential on a hugely influential group of people now, isn't it?
Yeah, Jack White called it the greatest rock album ever made.
Yep.
Joey Ramone, Marky Smith of The Fall, who also died a few years ago, Nick Cave, the Melvins, Buzz Osborne, or King Buzzo, whatever he calls himself, Henry Rollins, Steve Albini, who recently passed away. They have all expressed glowing sentiments about this. Now, not this album, but the third Stooges album, Raw Power, was accordingly Kurt Cobain's favorite album of all time. This album, listen, like with Led Zeppelin. Like in Led Zeppelin were not they were not a heavy metal band, but heavy metal is really unimaginable without Led Zeppelin. The same thing with the Stooges. The Stooges weren't really a punk rock band, but the sound and the style of punk rock is unimaginable without the Stooges.
Oh yeah, without that fury and without that repetitive bash out.
Right.
It's almost like meditative bashing out is what the Stooges were.
The Stooges are like I've always said that the Who really invented the template for punk rock in the mid 1960s. The Stooges are the missing link, not really missing, but they're the link between the Who,
bridge.
The bridge between the Who and what became punk rock in the mid to late 1970s. The Stooges are that bridge band. And I mean, the Damned covered the Stooges on their very first debut album, Damned, Damned, Damned. The Sex Pistols in their early days covered the Stooges. They really are. It's just unimaginable.
They are the epitome of proto-punk. And I would say that TVI from this record
Yeah.
is a punk that's a punk song.
Yeah.
Some of the rest of it, like the last three songs on the record where they get into the saxophone stuff.
Yeah.
That stuff is just amazing because
Right.
it really truly is unclassifiable. It's just this sort of it's like this bash out jazz, hypnotic, almost trance like
Yeah.
songs.
Very
And
trancy.
and
Yeah.
again, I'm telling you, the marijuana smoke basement in a serial killer's house. That's where it's coming from, man.
Yeah.
It is dark and guttural, but it is just awesome. And it's basically it's a party music for misanthropes.
Chris here again. We usually end our episodes by inviting you to join our Curmudgeonly community page on Facebook. Well, we're picking up our efforts there. Know people just as passionate as us about rock and roll? Invite them to join in the fun. You don't actually need our permission to do so. Also, expect to see a lot more content up there moving forward. Our mission is to engage you, so darn it, we'll engage you like a fire hose, or maybe like a firehouse if we're going to give love to Gene Simmons. We may also be making a few offers. Want to wear a t-shirt featuring our logo? You may have that opportunity soon. So be a fellow curmudgeon, help us expand our little community, and share your own musings via your own posts. We're at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock.
Let us continue now with our exploration of 1970. So we just covered a whole bunch of great albums, and the amazing thing about 1970 is there were a whole bunch of other great albums.
A lot.
A lot of albums. We're about to talk about 10 of them, and pretty extraordinary tensum or the decalogue here. And so we'll get into this. We'll do it in a semi-lightning round format. The first of these would not have been out of place on the discussion in our discussion of soft rock. The difference
Sure.
being is it's a much better record than most of those records.
Except
Right.
for after the Gold Rush.
Except for after the Gold Rush.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yes. Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water. The reason younger generations of music fans are oh so familiar with the name Simon and Garfunkel and at least three of their most classic songs is because by the time of this album's release in 1970, Simon and Garfunkel were huge. And when I say that, I mean they were arguably the only American group in the pop rock sphere that could stand toe-to-toe with the Beatles in popularity. Between 1965 and 1970, they had 7 top 10 hits in the Billboard pop chart, 3 of them going to number 1, with 2 of those top 10 hits and 1 of those number 1s coming off this album. The dirty little secret about Simon and Garfunkel, though, is that up until Bridge Over Troubled Water, their studio albums were a rather mixed bag. Moments of songwriting brilliance, notably the singles, offset by indulgent conceptual conceits. See the joke songs on Parsley, Sage, Rosemary, and Thyme, and the wayward experimental crap of Bookends, and insufferably wussy twee songs. This album, however, is all killer and no filler, the tightest, most concise, most focused, most lyrically poetic body of work on an album that Paul Simon would craft until 16 years later. You know which album that is.
Yep.
Meaning Graceland. The huge hits speak for themselves. The gospel ballad title track that became an international pop standard, as well as Cecilia, the good time romp that presages Simon's interest in African rhythms by several years, and the epic melancholy ballad The Boxer. But there's my personal favorite song on the entire album, The Only Living Boy in New York. Ostensibly, it's about Simon complaining about Art Garfunkel taking time off from recording so he could film a movie. It nevertheless demonstrates Simon's genius for taking any kind of emotion, any kind of mental state, and translating it into universal existential pain that anyone in the world can relate to. Kind of like John Lennon in a way. It's just a touching, overpowering song, another highlight of the album and another track that shows off Simon's versatility as both a musician and interpreter is the orchestral pop masterpiece El Condor Pasa. a cover of a song by Peruvian composer Daniel Alomía Robles, a track based on indigenous Peruvian Andean folk music and originating as Robles's Zarzuela of the same name from 1913, Zarzuela being the name of a kind of Spanish musical theater that spread out to other Spanish-speaking countries in the Latin American world. Bridge Over Troubled Water is a breathtaking work of profound beauty that, aside from being one of the best-selling albums of the 1970s, is a high watermark in 20th century pop music. Chris?
Yeah, it spent 10 weeks at number one at the beginning of 1970. So it's probably that and Deja Vu, I think, were the two biggest records of 1970
Yeah.
overall. And yeah, really, really great stuff. I've always been a huge fan of the title track. Art Garfunkel's vocal performance on that is pretty stunning.
Try singing that in karaoke.
Yeah, yeah. you know, but and then just I kind of grew up on Paul Simon. My mother was big into Paul Simon and Simon and Garfunkel, and so she loved The Boxer. So that was a song that I heard a lot as a kid. Cecilia was another one of those songs. And yeah, you're right about The Only Living Boy in New York. That's just showed that Paul Simon had a formalism to him where he could really kind of capture the emotion and be the songwriter, be the interpreter of the emotions, and it was just really, really good stuff. And so, yeah, just really, really strong album, and it was the first great Paul Simon.
Yes.
And he would be great again at least twice.
Yeah.
After that, maybe
Right.
three times, but this was
Right.
the first truly great Paul Simon.
Right. Speaking of great, next, The Grateful Dead and their two albums of this year, Working Man's Dead and American Beauty. We went into both of these albums in detail in the second part of our two-part episode, The Grateful Dead in the Studio, A Legacy. We will make sure to provide a link to that episode when we publish this episode. Hint, hint, Chris. But we will give a brief encapsulation of the greatness of these two albums. Basically, these two records are where the Dead abandoned the studio experimentation, sonic indulgences, and instrumental improvisations that characterized their previous three albums and saw them embrace tight song structures, appealing vocal harmonies, and focus on American roots music, particularly country, folk, and blues, all while presenting it in a distinctly Dead flavor with their loose rhythms, sense of space, and Jerry Garcia's exquisite guitar playing. They did all this while, over the course of these two albums, producing some of their most famous and iconic songs: Uncle John's Band, Casey Jones, Truckin', Sugar Magnolia, Friend of the Devil, and several more. American Beauty, in particular, is my pick for the Dead's single greatest album. Chris?
Yeah, I think that these are two of the three best Grateful Dead records. I'm partial to Blues for Allah as well as these two. I think the best song on either of these records is New Speedway Boogie. Always been a huge fan of that song. The groove on that song is really, really cool. I think American Beauty overall is probably a better record than Working Man's Dead. But to put them together, and they're really bookends of an exploration. And we talked earlier in the episode about how like the baby boomer generation was sort of maturing, and they were winding down the party.
Right.
And I mean, literally, the Dead had escaped San Francisco to get away from all the drugs and all the craziness, and so that they could actually focus on the music. And out of that, being on the farm comes the bluegrass, comes the country, comes the bluesier stuff, comes the more sort of the harmony vocals stuff. The Addicts of My Life, which which is another song I absolutely love. And so this was sort of the Dead sort of declaring that they could be like a serious artiste kind of band, as well as being the foremost jam meisters in the world.
So from one legendary Bay Area band to another, Chris, tell us a little bit about Creedence Clearwater Revival's greatest album, Cosmo's Factory.
Yes, and it is their greatest album. Now, it can be argued that no band enjoyed as amazing of a calendar year as Creedence Clearwater Revival did in 1969. This Bay Area quartet, led by songwriting genius John Fogerty, helped set the template for Southern rock with three truly great album releases that year: Bayou Country, Green River, and Willie and the Poor Boys, all of the same excellent quality, and all three records producing multiple hit singles and establishing the band firmly as an A-lister. Now, how did CCR follow up that singular feat in 1970? By releasing one album, Cosmos Factory, that was actually better than those other three,
Yeah.
and I think way better. I think it's their best record. The rockers rocked even harder. The covers, like Bo Diddley's "Before You Accuse Me, Take a Look at Yourself," and an 11-minute jammy take on Motown's "I Heard It Through the Grapevine," were even smarter, even sharper, and even more orthodox. And then there was an also new infusion of soul music here, as on the hits "Looking Out My Back Door" and "Who'll Stop the Rain." The latter, which is absolutely incredible, is the album's true standout track. After the release of Cosmos Factory, not Cosmosis, Cosmosis rhymes with osmosis. After the release of Cosmos Factory, ego clashes soon ate the band alive, and an ill-advised decision to democratize the band's songwriting in subsequent years proved ruinous. But with its four-album streak of great releases that culminated in the 1970 release Cosmos Factory, CCR established itself as perhaps the greatest band in American history, at least in this curmudgeon's opinion. I think they're definitely in the top two.
I still have the Velvet Underground as the greatest and most influential American band, not solo artist, band of all time. But Cosmos Factory is a really good argument for CCR being that band. And yeah, this is a timeless, flawless masterpiece. It's basically the rock and roll album Elvis Presley wishes he could have made during this time.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, you've said that in casual conversations with me before. Could you imagine if like Elvis had the freedom to sing John Fogerty songs?
Yeah,
and how perfect that would have been?
Ditch the Colonel and get the band CCR to be his band.
Yeah, I mean, like seriously, like just some of the like Elvis singing "Down on the Corner," or actually, could you imagine Elvis singing "Who'll Stop the Rain"?
Yeah.
I mean that could have been absolutely amazing. I mean that would have been as good as the Chips Moman stuff that Elvis did on From Elvis in Memphis in '68. So, or '69 actually. So there you go. There. Next,
another Bay Area band, the last Bay Area band.
we're staying in the Bay. So the Grateful Dead were not the only erstwhile jam masters from the Bay Area who turned a corner in 1970. There was also Santana, or clearly Arturo's a Hispanic here, not me. Santana. They were the Latin fusion ensemble fronted by honest to goodness guitar god Carlos Santana. Abraxas was the band's second album and a more consistent effort than their self-titled 1969 debut. The Mexican-born Santana played with a rhythmic sensuality that could take the most droll of Peter Green-led Fleetwood Mac songs like Black Magic Woman and turn it into something truly exotic and lovely. He could also turn a classy jazz number like Tito Puente's Oye Como Va into an amped-up psychedelic rock freakout. Yeah. Beyond Carlos's magical powers, there also were the various percussionists on Abraxas who gave the album an undeniable flavor. Their work on the album practically sizzles its way through the speakers, much like carne asada. What do you say?
Carne asada. Yeah, Santana doesn't get enough credit for opening the ears of Western rock music fans, i.e., white Western rock.
Yeah, to Latin rhythms.
To Latin rhythms and Latin music in general. Yeah. He really deserves credit for doing that in the late 60s, early 1970s with those first two albums, Santana and Abraxas. And this, I still don't think it's his best album. I think the third Santana album, the third and final one, the lineup, which we will discuss in the next episode of this series.
Yeah, that's a crazy ass record. Was it Santana 3?
Yeah, but Abraxas is pretty astounding in its own right. The musicianship, the chops, the depth, the vision, the breadth of the material, the energy, the soulfulness. This is the cream of the crop of Latin rock for sure.
Yeah, and strange but true, but the band Journey's co-founder Greg Raleigh was
Yeah.
Santana's organist slash keyboardist and lead singer. So when you hear Black Magic Woman on classic rock radio, that is Greg Raleigh's voice that you hear singing that song, the co-founder of Journey of all
Right.
bands.
And the guitarist, Neil Sean, was a part of Santana as well.
Yeah, not on this record though.
Now, yeah, you would join later.
Yeah.
Anyway, next, another great album from 1970, Curtis Mayfield and his solo debut, Curtis. Now, toward the end of the 1960s, The Impressions, the Chicago R&B soul group for whom Curtis Mayfield was the leader, main songwriter, and producer, were already delving into the political arena with socially conscious message songs such as 1968's They Don't Know and 1969's Choice of Colors. This at a time, mind you, when Marvin Gaye was still singing I Heard It Through the Grapevine and Stevie Wonder was still swooning to ballads like My Cherie Amour. Yet, after the Impressions came to an end and Mayfield ventured into a solo career with his astounding 1970 solo debut album, Curtis, Mayfield doubled down on socio-political commentary and messages of Black self-determination and racial identity. Even more impressively, Mayfield expanded his musical palette to encompass rock, funk, and orchestral pop, following through on the innovative spark started by Isaac Hayes just a year before with his classic Hot Buttered Soul album. The epic opening track, Don't Worry If There's a Hell Below, We're All Going to Go, augments one of the greatest bass lines in history.
Oh, hell yeah.
With a tasteful staccato string arrangement to create a polemic statement where Mayfield boldly expounds on the notion of racism and ignorance being a universal problem facing people of all cultures up and down the socioeconomic ladder. The poverty and drug addiction gripping the inner cities are chronicled in the sweeping, cinematic The Other Side of Town, while We the People Who Are Darker Than Blue takes the lyrical anger of an African-American community fed up with how the world perceives them and processes it through a subtly tense, beautiful piece of orchestral soul. There is positivity, however, with the rich, horn-driven gospel soul of Move On Up and the denouncement of conventional beauty standards with the gorgeous, lush Miss Black America. If an alien came down to Earth and wanted a primer education on 1970s soul music, Curtis Mayfield's Curtis should unquestionably be sample A. Chris?
Yeah, or sample A, B, or C. It's one of the three.
Right.
Niggas, whiteys,
Jews,
crackers, Jews, sisters.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like that combined with that fat ass bass line. It's one of the most rousing opening tracks on a black music album of all time. I mean,
on any music, any album.
Yeah, but I'm signaling this out because Curtis he rams forth into the 1970s with undeniable blackness.
Yeah,
and he's taking up all forms, like you said, rock, funk, even a little bit of jazz, and just a little bit of that kind of the flavor in the arrangements, and like to have that song, If There's a Hell Below, and Moving On Up on the same damn record.
Yeah.
And those being the poles of your record, it doesn't matter what the rest of the record's like. That's a great record.
Yeah.
So God bless Curtis Mayfield. The guy was like just an incredible, incredible talent. And then, of course, what was it? 2 years later that he came out with Superfly.
Right.
So he had himself a streak there in the 70s. And then a couple years later, he had Future Shock, which I always loved. So yeah, he had himself quite a decade in the 70s.
Speaking of brilliant black artists who got soul music started in a new direction and really expanded the parameters of R&B, soul, and funk, here comes Funkadelic. Chris.
Oh, Free Your Mind and Your Ass Will Follow, on which a bunch of steady veteran R&B musicians from Detroit take copious amounts of drugs and create psychedelic rock. The 10-minute title track is a jaw-dropping feat of whacked-out funk rock thunder, with sound effect trickery slinked around all the guitar fuzz that needs to be heard through good headphones to truly be appreciated.
Yeah,
George
you do.
Clinton, yeah, George Clinton and his bandmates gave you the world a sharp taste of what was to come over the course of the 1970s on Free Your Mind and Your Ass Will Follow. If nothing else, it set the nasty ass guitar driven slop funk high bar that Funkadelic's follow up album, Maggot Brain, actually surpassed in
Mm,
1971. I love this record, and I especially love the title track. That is like one funky ass, like just wacky ass song, and it's one of my favorite treadmill songs. By the way, when I'm on the treadmill,
yeah.
uh, a 30-minute treadmill workout is that song put on repeat 3 times.
Right. Yeah, it's funny how like George Clinton, his short-term influence was more felt throughout the 1970s with Parliament, but with Funkadelic, it would be more far-reaching.
Yeah,
You hear Funkadelic in Prince in the
yeah,
1980s. You hear bits of Funkadelic in the 1990s of some of the neo soul coming out, and especially in 21st, some of the more outre areas of R&B and soul of the 21st century with
yeah,
groups like Salt. You hear Funkadelic more in that than
yeah. I
anything.
think D'Angelo was pretty much
D'Angelo
was
too.
big time influenced by Funkadelic as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
So
mean Dr. Dre was more Parliament than Funkadelic.
right, right.
Yeah, but
Oh,
Funkadelic, yeah, is a hugely influential group. I mean, as black rock stars,
yeah.
they really kind of took the cake, you know.
All right, so we go from black soul to white boy soul.
Yep.
Here we have Van Morrison with 2 albums, Moondance and his band and the Street Choir. In our 1968 installment of our second Golden Age of Rock series, we talked at length about Van Morrison's mystic jazz folk masterpiece, Astral Weeks, an album that, despite our own best efforts, really defies categorization and to this day is on any respected music media outlets list of the 100 greatest albums of all time. It got critical adoration in its day as well, which is why Warner Brothers stuck with Morrison even when the album didn't sell very well at all. Well, it was time for Morrison to reward his record company's patience, and that he did with Moondance, one of the most beloved albums in the man's voluminous and honestly rather excessively prolific discography. This is the album that marked the beginning of Morrison's both commercial and creative hot streak, Astral Weeks notwithstanding, that lasted until the early 1980s. The patented Van Morrison sound was finally and forever established here. American R&B and soul firmly rooted in the nexus of Ray Charles, Sam Cooke, and Jackie Wilson. Musical flourishes, textures, and rhythms owing more than a little to blues and jazz, the emotional swell of gospel, dashes of traditional Irish folk here, dashes of American country music there, and all delivered with expertly crafted horn arrangements that give the whole formula a seemingly orchestral swell. Some of the man's most well known songs are on here: the jazz standard title track, the absolutely stunning folk soul masterworks, And It Stoned Me and Into the Mystic, and the deeply moving gospel ballad Brand New Day. The album went top 30 in the US, top 40 in the UK, and the former 3 tracks all became staples of AOR radio. The follow up album, His Band and the Street Choir, also coming out in 1970, may well have been Moondance Part 2 in its
Yeah.
style and sound. But this is in no way a belittlement to a record that, if anything, had a more spacious production and harder punching sound. The turbocharged R&B stomper Domino was a massive top 10 hit, and Call Me Up in Dreamland has one of the greatest examples of vocal and horn arrangement call and response dynamics ever put on a pop record. I've Been Working sounds exactly like what you would expect if you put John Lee Hooker in front of a superb R&B combo band. And again, with If I Needed Someone, Morrison proves that he's probably the greatest white singer of black gospel music ever, Elvis
Yeah.
included. Both of these albums are essential listening. Chris?
Yeah, they are, especially Moondance. Moondance to me is one of the top 100 albums ever made. I would put it in
Yeah.
my top 100. I think that it's a perfect record. You forgot to mention Crazy Love,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is just another like that's Morrison busting out a beautiful falsetto, which
Yeah.
kind of comes out of nowhere, but it's pretty amazing. Yeah, Moondance is if Astral Weeks was kind of his was his Folk in the Woods album, and
Yeah.
his his kind of his letting his artistic flag fly.
Yeah.
Moondance was his pop statement. I mean,
Right.
this was kind of his Frank Sinatra moment. you know,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
like
It really
Morrison
was.
doing a Frank Sinatra record, and it's there. His band in the Street Choir, honestly, I'm not as quite as familiar with it, but the stuff that I am familiar with is definitely more on the soul tip than
Yeah.
Moondance is more sort of a pop standardy kind of record, whereas this
Yeah.
is more sort of like more straightforward blue-eyed soul. But Domino is fucking fantastic
Yeah.
and is one of the better singles that came out in 1970.
Yeah. So speaking of white guys from the UK with a love of American roots music and gospel, here's Elton John with an album that you would not expect Elton John to make. This is before, well, Chris, I'll let you carry it. Tumbleweed Connection.
Yeah, Tumbleweed Connection. This is before Elton went glam and before he went full pop. Before then, he was dabbling in gospel and blues and roots music, and it was more sort of country-ish and more acoustic and in some ways gentler.
Yeah.
But it could be just as rousing. So anyway, some of our younger listeners probably know Elton John as the chubby gay guy who used to do arena tours with Billy Joel, sellouts by a couple of sellouts.
Yeah.
But there was a reason John was in a position to sell out so hard in the first place. There was about an 8-year period in the 1970s where the artist born Reginald Dwight in 1947 was one of the best, most consistent rock and roll performers on the planet. His
Yeah.
magical hot streak effectively started here in 1970 with the release of Tumbleweed Connection. John swaggers and struts his way through these songs, starting with the colossally rousing R&B-ish Ballad of a Well-Known Gun, great song, and ending with the epic and at first beautiful and then balls out rock and burn down the mission.
Yeah.
God bless Elton John, the real Elton John, that is. Arturo.
Yeah, Amarina is another great song from
Yeah.
here that was used in the opening credits to the Sidney Lumet movie Dog Day Afternoon in
Oh,
1975,
that's
starring
right.
Al Pacino.
There's a
Yeah,
movie I haven't seen in at least 30 years.
yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I
Yeah.
love this album. I think this is one of Elton John's two very best. This sits alongside Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, two very different albums from two very different periods of Elton's career, just 3 years apart.
Yeah, pretty amazing.
All
As
right.
is our next record.
Oh, yes, the next one. Led Zeppelin with Led Zeppelin 3. Now, of all the great albums in Led Zeppelin's illustrious catalog, the third album is the one that gets unfairly overlooked. While it did do very well commercially, Zeppelin were one of the biggest bands in the world by the fall of 1970, it didn't do as well as their first two albums, mainly because of the abundance of acoustic songs on the album's second half. Yes, Zeppelin's popularity was such that selling 6 million copies in the US and 1 million in the UK and selling millions of more elsewhere around the world was considered a disappointment.
Yeah.
However, the passage of time combined with Led Zeppelin's ubiquitous presence on album-oriented classic rock radio has somewhat rehabilitated this album's reputation, particularly the beautiful run of acoustic songs on the second half. Gallows Pole is Led Zeppelin's rearrangement of the centuries old, traditional folk song, The Maid Freed from the Gallows Pole, is epic in its soft to rocking structure and soaring in its ability to maintain its intensity throughout. Tangerine is one of the band's most stirring and beautiful ballads, something Zeppelin were very underrated for.
Yeah.
Brawny R. Stomp, while deeply indebted to British folk singer Bert Jansch's Wagoner's Lad, is completely remade in Zeppelin's own style, showing their versatility by delving into straight up hoedown country music. The first half of the album is absolute peak Zeppelin, with one of the band's most famous and iconic songs, Immigrant Song, kicking things off with an almost heavy metal romp and its ode to Nordic Viking adventures. Another of Zeppelin's greatest ballads, the yearning epic blues of Since I've Been Loving You, is also here, as are the rockers' Celebration Day and Out on the Tiles, songs that have some of Jimmy Page's most behemoth riffs. The only thing Led Zeppelin 3 can be criticized for is not being as good as the game-changing first two albums and the masterpiece fourth album to come a year later. Chris?
But it's still pretty fucking good.
Yeah.
Still really, really good. My favorite song on this album has always been "Out on the Tiles," which is
Oh, wow.
just those both of those riffs, at least this year, have been getting stuck in my head routinely, and so
Really?
I've
Wow.
been listening to that song a whole bunch. You know, ba-da-da-na,
Yeah, yeah,
ba-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na-na, you know, and then
yeah.
that kick-ass outro, that bow bow ba-dow ba-dow
Yeah.
ba-dow
Yeah.
ba-dow
Yeah.
da-dow. And so I've just been vibing on that song all year. So but no, but this is a special record because of the contrast between songs like that and Celebration Day, which rock
Yeah.
balls, and then the
Yeah.
stuff like Tangerine
Right.
and a little bit softer, or like, you know, or stuff like exotic stuff like Friends and Bronny
Right.
R. Stomp. So
Yeah.
it's an eclectic record. I think it's a balanced record. It's as balanced as the others. Yeah, is it as good as the other three? No, but it's damn close, and
Yeah.
that's
Really
a
is.
good thing you can say about it.
Yeah. Now, speaking of heavy British rock, especially heavy British rock that followed in Led Zeppelin's wake, Chris?
Yeah, Deep Purple with Deep Purple in Rock, which has one of the goofiest covers of all time, with the members of Deep Purple depicted as the heads on Mount Rushmore. Uh, but anyway, most people know of Deep Purple via their hits, namely the classic rock staples Hush and Smoke on the Water. Rock geek iconoclasts like us laugh lovingly at the band's goofiest numbers, Highway Star and Space Truckin'. Uh, they're a big enough band to be the answer to a good trivia night question, really. But they deserve more respect than that, ultimately. In 1970, Deep Purple were one hell of a great proto metal band, and Deep Purple and Rock is one of the best early heavy metal albums. Not quite on the level of Black Sabbath's Paranoid, but great enough to make the short list of proto metal essentials. Check out especially Bloodsucker, on which Richie Blackmore gives Tony Iommi a run for his money as a devil-inspired riffmeister, and Flight of the Rat, during which, as Arturo pointed out to me years ago, and rightly so, you can practically hear Judas Priest being born. Seriously, this rollicking piece of metallic fury is that band's sole template. Personally, I most enjoy Ian Gillan's almost cartoonish falsetto range on Child and Time. The man had the most glorious high register in all of metal, bar none.
Or,
Ah!
or as Chris Needs, the famous British music critic, once pointed out, he just sounds like a man with his balls trapped in a bear trap.
I can't do any better than that. Arturo, give me your thoughts on Deep Purple and Rock. I
Oh,
love
listen,
this album.
this album's hugely and underratedly, maybe not underratedly, but hugely influential on the heavy metal that would come later in the mid to late 1970s by the likes of, yes, Judas Priest and Iron Maiden.
Hmm.
Big touchstone influence on early Iron Maiden sound, and what would eventually become the new wave of British heavy metal that also influenced bands like Metallica and the whole thrash metal scene of the early 1980s. Deep Purple is a touchstone band for that, and even Lars Ulrich himself has kind of admitted it explicitly that Deep Purple was like before the new wave of British heavy metal. It was Deep Purple that he was into, and you
Hmm.
can hear it. Yeah, Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath forever. But Deep Purple deserved mention as having a more specific influence on that what we became known as British metal. And that really, you start with Deep Purple there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so we come to the end of this list of 10 records with maybe, I don't know if it's the best, but it's pretty damn close as far as,
It's in the top 5 albums of this year for sure.
yeah.
The Velvet Underground, Loaded. When the Velvet Underground were in the studio recording the songs that would become Loaded, like the Beatles a year earlier with Abbey Road, they knew it would be their final album. Unlike the Beatles, it wasn't interpersonal discord and financial disputes that meant the end of the road for the VU, but rather the fact that the general public didn't really care about them. They just didn't sell enough records, and their concert tours weren't even breaking even, with underattended shows everywhere except for a few select cities. This was a classic case of a band being way too ahead of their time, as would be proven throughout the next 20 plus years when their influence on a multitude of rock subgenres would become pervasive. But for now, in 1970, if the Velvets were going to go out, their chief songwriter Lou Reed made sure they did so with a bang. After bassist, keyboardist, viola player John Cale left the band a couple of years earlier, Reed had begun steering the band toward a slightly more commercial, more radio-friendly sound. On Loaded, Reed and the VU proved they could make, well, went to that radio-friendly sound with their third album, the self-titled The Velvet Underground album, but this album is much better. On this record, Unloaded, the VU proved they could make swinging, anthemic, powerfully rocking, catchy radio rock that could stand alongside the Stones, Zeppelin, The Who, or CCR without losing none of the poetic power and artful grace that marked their earlier work. With Sweet Jane and Rock and Roll, two of Reed's most beloved and timelessly enduring songs, not only do the band rock out with exquisite beauty and force, they are both rousing odes to the power of love and rock and roll itself, respectfully. Who Loves the Sun is an affectionate vamp on the classic surf rock sound of the Beach Boys, while New Age, one of Reed's greatest ballads, is a heartwarming tale of a washed-up old Hollywood star desperate to reclaim her youth, comforting the old star with the knowledge that she isn't getting older, but in fact entering, quote, a new age. I Found a Reason is a wonderfully rendered tribute to Reed's beloved doo-wop genre. Head Held High is a turbocharged rocker that rocks with the best the VU ever offered. And it ends with one of the most fascinating songs in the entire VU canon, Oh Sweet Nothing. For a man who famously hated hippie rock, it's striking to hear Lou Reed write a song that very much has the loose stoner swing vibe of the Grateful Dead.
Yeah.
With some Sterling Morrison guitar noodling that has more than a passing resemblance to Jerry Garcia.
Yeah, for
and
sure.
vocal harmonies that could come straight out of Working Man's Dead. For a band that I call the greatest and most influential American rock band of all time, putting an end to their discography with a note-for-note perfect classic like Loaded is as fitting as it gets. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. This is my favorite of the VU records. It's probably not the most influential. That might be White Heat, but
Or the first one.
Or the first one. But this album is pretty amazing. In just a consistent collection of pop melodies. And just they were going for orthodox in a lot of ways orthodox radio rock, just sort of proving to themselves that they could do it. Or it's like, this is kind of like we could have been a contender record.
Yeah.
And so they're going out proving, as what could have been, if we could get anybody to the yard, this is the album that would propel us to greatness. And
right.
it's almost like a kind of a fuck you to the industry for pigeonholing them as an art band instead of one that could maybe be commercially viable.
Right.
It's like Lou's Revenge. And then of course, 10, 15, 20 years later, the Velvets get their cult and boom, they become a huge act. They have a nice act from the 90s on, or a nice sort of renaissance. So
right.
More power to them. And then this album to me though is the shining beacon for the Lou Reed canon as far as the VU period goes.
All right. So that is the end. Yes, we've finished.
We have come to the end. We have come to the end. So what would you say overall thematically about 1970, and what do we say is the legacy of 1970?
Rock spreads out. It's just stylistically, rock and R&B soul, especially R&B with Funkadelic and Curtis Mayfield branching out the way they did. Even James Brown branching out the way he did. And rock in general, there's a wide variety of styles in all the rock albums that we covered. Even within the solo Beatles, there's a wide
Yeah.
variety of styles. Even within the soft rock section, there's a wide variety within there.
Yeah.
And it sets the stage for, again, an even wider variety of music to come for the rest of the 1970s. And
Yeah.
1970, like I said earlier, is kind of the ground zero for that little spark.
Yeah, I guess you could say that this is kind of the year where rock and roll split as a genre split open like an egg,
Yeah,
and the yolk came to bear.
right, right.
So it's pretty astonishing, like you said, the eclecticism and the range of the stuff. I mean, one of the reasons that we covered as many albums as we did is because we kind of had to, because
Yeah,
to tell the full story of 1970 it's a pretty extraordinary ride. I think it's one of the best years in rock history. I think it's
sure.
there. It's right up there for me with like 71 and 74 and like 92 and just
91.
yeah, 91 and just a bunch of others. I mean, it's just really, really wonderful, wonderful year. And I'm glad that we were able to do this run through it and to do this tribute to it here on the Curmudgeon Rock Report. And with that, folks, as we always do at the end of these episodes, we encourage you, we implore you even to join our Facebook Curmudgeonly community, on which discussions are to be had. We had a tribute to Steve Albini up there recently, and we encourage you to join and to engage in the discussion. We want to make that community as freewheeling as possible. So please sign up and join. It's invite only, but chances are we'll let you in so long as you're allowed within 500 feet of a school. So facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock. Also, if you have any thoughts of your own about 1970, if you disagree with any of our choices or anything we said, if you think that the soft rock albums are actually amazing and Arturo's full of shit, you can tell us. You can send us email at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. Definitely feel free to hit us up and drop us a line there. And then also look out for the link to a Spotify playlist that will compile a bunch of this great music from 1970 for your listening pleasure to accompany you as you listen to the Curmudgeon Rock Report. It goes hand in hand, and it enhances the experience. Trust us, I've tried it myself.